Hey girl, this is a piece from God, I'm funny. Okay, this is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, edited by Sean Matt Gamna. This is from Section 3 of the book, which is titled Finland, Baltics, Romania, Iran, 1939 to 41, Russian Imperialism, question mark. What was I going to say? Yeah, there's a little introduction to the section as a whole, which I'm going to read now, and then I'll read the piece that's the content of this video. Stalin invaded Finland on the 30th of November 1939. The war continued until the 13th of March 1940, when it concluded with limited territorial gains for Stalin. This war inflamed the faction fight among the Trotskyists. The dispute over eastern Poland had been a dispute about a fait accompli, whereas Finland was an ongoing undecided issue. Stalin invaded the Baltic states in June 1940 and eastern Romania in June-July 1940. These are territories, quote, allocated, end quote, to Stalin in the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and Britain and Russia jointly invaded Iran in August-September 1941. So that's the introduction to the section as a whole. I just want to look at the Wikipedia real quick for the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. The Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran, or Anglo-Soviet invasion of Persia, was the joint invasion of the neutral imperialist state of Iran by the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union in August 1941. The two powers announced that they would stay until 6 months after the end of the war with their enemy, Nazi Germany, which turned out to be 2nd of March 1946. On the date the British began to withdraw, but the Soviet Union delayed until May, citing, quote, threats to Soviet security, end quote. On that date, the British began to withdraw, but the Soviet Union delayed until May, citing, quote, threats to Soviet security, end quote. The invasion, codenamed Operation Countenance, was largely unopposed by the numerically and technologically outmatched Iranian forces. The multi-pronged coordinated invasion took place along Iran's borders with the Kingdom of Iraq, Azerbaijan, SSR, SSR. I was thinking, how many S's did I say? Turkmen, SSR, with fighting beginning on the 25th of August and ending on the 31st of August, when the Iranian government formally agreed to surrender, having already agreed to a ceasefire on the 30th of August. The invasion took place 2 months after the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's subsequent alliance with the United Kingdom. The attack also took place less than 2 months after Allied victories over pro-Axis forces in neighboring Iraq and French Syria and Lebanon. The invasion's strategic purpose was to ensure the safety of Allied supplies to the USSR, see the Persian corridor, secure Iranian oil fields, limit German influence in Iran. Reza Shah had leveraged Germany to offset the British and Soviet spheres of influence on Iran, and preempt a possible Axis advance from Turkey through Iran toward the Baku oil fields or British India. Following the invasion on the 16th of September 1941, Reza Shah abdicated and went into exile, being replaced by his young son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Iran would remain under Allied occupation until 1946. According to Wikipedia, the Soviet occupation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina says, or the entry for that says, between the 28th of June and the 3rd of July 1940, the Soviet Union occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina following an ultimatum made to Romania on the 26th of June 1940 that threatened the use of force. These regions, with a total area of 50,762 square kilometers, 19,599 square miles, and a population of 3,776,309 inhabitants, were incorporated into the Soviet Union. On the 26th of October 1940, 6 Romanian islands on the Chilia branch of the Danube, with an area of 23.75 kilometers squared, 9.17 square miles, were also occupied by the Soviet Army. The Soviet Union had planned to accomplish the annexation with a full-scale invasion, but the Romanian government responded to the Soviet ultimatum delivered on the 26th of June, agreed to withdraw from the territories to avoid a military conflict. The use of force had been made illegal by the conventions for the definition of aggression in July 1933, but from an international legal standpoint, the new status of the annexed territories was eventually based on a formal agreement through which Romania consented to the retrocession of Bessarabia and the cession of northern Bukovina. As it was not mentioned in the ultimatum, the annexation of the Herzegovina region was not consented to by Romania, and the same is true of the subsequent Soviet occupation of the Danube Islands. On the 24th of June, Nazi Germany, which had acknowledged the Soviet interest in Bessarabia in a secret protocol in the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, had been made aware prior to the planned ultimatum, but did not inform the Romanian authorities and was unwilling to provide support. On the 22nd of June, France, a guarantor of Romanian borders, fell to Nazi advances. This is considered to be an important factor in the Soviets' decision to issue the ultimatum. The Soviet invasion of Bukovina in 1940 violated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact since it went beyond the Soviet sphere of influence and had been agreed with the Axis. On the 2nd of August 1940, the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic was proclaimed as a constituent republic of the Soviet Union, encompassing most of Bessarabia and part of the Moldavian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic and Autonomous Republic of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic on the left bank of the Dniester, or I don't know if I'm saying that right, now the breakaway Transnistria. The Herzegovina region and the regions inhabited by Slavic majorities, northern Bukovina, northern and southern Bessarabia, were included in the Ukrainian SSR. A period of political persecution, including executions, deportations to labor camps, and arrests, occurred during the Soviet administration. In July 1941, the Romanian and German troops occupied Bessarabia, northern Bukovina, and Herzegovina during the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union. A military administration was established and the region's Jewish population was executed on the spot or deported to Transnistria, where large numbers were killed. In August 1944, during the Soviet Second Jassy-Kishinev offensive, the Axis war effort on the Eastern Front collapsed. The coup of the 23rd of August 1944 caused the Romanian army to cease resisting the Soviet advance and to join the fight against Germany. Soviet forces advanced from Bessarabia to Romania, captured much of its standing army as prisoners of war, and occupied the country. On the 12th of September 1944, Romania signed the Moscow Armistice with the Allies. The armistice and the subsequent peace treaty of 1947 confirmed the Soviet-Romanian border as it was on the 1st of January 1941. Bessarabia, northern Bukovina, and Herzegovina remained part of the Soviet Union until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, when Bessarabia, northern Bukovina, and Herzegovina became part of the newly independent states of Moldova and Ukraine. The Declaration of Independence of Moldova on the 27th of August 1991 declared the Soviet occupation illegal. So, sorry, I just wanted to look those things up real quick. Okay, so the piece I'm actually reading is titled, It is Finnish Workers' Duty to be Soviet Partisans. This is from the Socialist Workers' Party 1939. So here we go. Until a few days ago, it appeared that the original demands of the Soviet government upon Finland would be peaceably compromised. Suddenly, however, all indications of compromise seem to have disappeared. Why? What has happened? You cannot tell from the preposterous and wild vituperations in the Soviet press or its repetition in the Stalinist press, nor can you tell from the anti-Soviet propaganda which dominates the, quote, democratic press. As in all other questions connected with the Second World War, we in the, quote, third camp, the camp of revolutionary struggle against the war, must make our analysis independent of both the warring camps. The general international situation is characterized by continuation of the attempts of Britain to reach an agreement with German imperialism minus Hitler. Such a peace would be made at the expense of the Soviet Union. The Soviet bureaucracy is aware of the mortal danger which the prospects of a British-German peace would signify for the Soviet Union. Having no faith in the international working class, the Soviet bureaucracy has placed its fate on pacts with one imperialist power or another. For 5 years, it deluded the workers with slogans for, quote, defense of the democracies, end quote. Now that Hitler is the ally, the Stalinist press whines that the British are attempting to assassinate Hitler and replace Hitler by a regime which would agree to turn its guns against the Soviet Union. Therefore, this is plainly indicated by the Stalinist press. Hitler should be defended against assassination or overthrow. The Kremlin lives in deadly fear of the possibility that, despite all the Kremlin's courting of German imperialism will make peace with Britain and turn on Russia. It is against that dreaded day that the Kremlin moves in the Baltic. It is against that dreaded day that the Kremlin's moves in the Baltic are calculated. The military and naval outposts secured from the other Baltic countries, plus similar outposts from Finland, would close the defensive circle of the Baltic against Germany. But since the Kremlin is simultaneously wooing Hitler, the Kremlin cannot very well explain the real meaning of its Baltic moves. Hence, one of the most repulsive acts of the Kremlin's propaganda, its patent fraudulence, as fraudulent as the declaration that the Hitler-Stalin Pact would help Poland and the democracies, which the Stalinists were making until the Red Army marched into Poland. This cynical lying confuses and disorients the class-conscious workers everywhere, when in the days of Lenin and Trotsky, the Soviet power led its armies up to Warsaw and conquered Georgia. The class-conscious workers understood the necessity of these steps and defended these steps. For the foreign policy of the worker state was clearly in the interest of the world revolution, was developed and executed before the eyes of the international working class. The methods employed by Stalin in the Baltic are utterly alien to a revolutionary internationalist policy. Lenin and Trotsky called upon the Polish and Georgian workers to revolt and came to their aid with the Red Army. Stalin calls upon the Finnish people, not the workers, to change premiers. Instead of arousing the masses within the Baltic countries to overthrow their capitalist rulers and establish Soviet republics which would guard the Baltic against Germany, Stalin prefers pacts with the bourgeois rulers. The only kind of, quote, revolution, end quote, Stalin wants in the Baltic is the kind Stalin, quote, made, end quote, in backward Polish Galicia, bracket, i.e. the area invaded in 1939, end bracket, under the direction of the GPU. In our criticism of the military interventions of the Soviet bureaucracy, we sharply distinguish ourselves from the social, democratic, anarchist, and bourgeois critics of the Kremlin. These anti-revolutionary critics denounce the Soviet Union for using military force and for violating existing borders. For us, however, the borders of the capitalist world are not at all inviolate, and military force in the hands of a revolutionary government may very well serve the revolution. That the Kremlin's military intervention serves only the interests of the Kremlin and the Kremlin's imperialist ally, Hitler, in Poland, that it is carried out without consideration of the will and the feelings of the workers of the Soviet Union or the occupied territories or the international proletariat, that it compromises the Soviet Union and disorients the world working class. These are our criticisms, which in all fundamentals run counter to the standpoint of the Kremlin's non-revolutionary critics. The Social Democrats and other lackeys of the, quote, democratic and, quote, imperialists call upon the Finnish workers to defend Finland against the Red Army. We, on the contrary, apply to Finland, as to every other bourgeois country, our fundamental attitude toward imperialist wars. The Finnish government refuses to yield to Soviet demands for military outposts only because Finland is assured of the support of one or more great powers against the Soviet. The New York Times makes that plain enough in the New York Times November 28th editorial calling for a holy war against the Soviet Union. We are against the support of any imperialist power in any war, let alone a war against the Soviet Union, which remains, despite the Kremlin gang, upon the economic foundations laid down by the October Revolution. The task of the Finnish workers is to make the Finnish workers' own socialist revolution. Nothing else can avail the Finnish workers. The Finnish workers must destroy the Finnish bourgeoisie before they can cope with Stalin's demands upon Finland. If a struggle breaks out between bourgeois Finland and the Soviet Union, it is the duty of the Finnish workers to be Soviet partisans in that struggle. If the Soviet Union were led by revolutionaries, the Finnish Revolution would be made by the Finnish workers, with the assurance that the Finnish workers would receive the aid of the Soviet army against intervention by the imperialist powers. Instead, however, the brutish and provocative tactics of the Kremlin against Finland drive the Finnish workers into unity with the Finnish bourgeoisie. In this incident, as in all others, the tactics of the Kremlin serve to strengthen the imperialist front, which will eventually attempt to destroy the Soviet Union. Here is but the latest proof of our conviction that the defense of the Soviet Union cannot be left in the hands of the Kremlin clique, the armed overthrow of by the Soviet workers of the Stalinist bureaucracy. It will not yield its power by any other means, is vitally necessary if the Soviet Union is to be saved and become again what the Soviet Union was under Lenin and Trotsky, drill ground of the world revolution. This recording was from a piece from the Fate of the Russian Revolution. Was an abridged text that was originally titled "The Kremlin's Aims in the Finnish Crisis," which was an editorial in Socialist Appeal on the 1st of December, 1939. The end. Hey everybody, this is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, edited by Sean Matt Gamna. This piece is titled Stalin's Reactionary Wars. It's by Herman Benson. It's Herman Benson, I believe, forget what Herman Benson's deal was. Herman Benson, who lived from 1915 to 2020, was an American union reformer and machinist who founded and led the Association for Union Democracy based in Brooklyn, New York. Herman Benson fought corruption and racketeering within unions, defended rank-and-file union members' rights, and advocated union democracy for over 60 years. Following his death, New Politics, which is affiliated with Third Camp Trotskyism in the U.S., founded by Julius and Phyllis Jacobson, called Herman Benson, quote, the best-known advocate of union democracy in left labor circles, end quote. So, let's start. The crux of the dispute taking place in the party at the present time is it necessary to amend the party position in order to exclude support to reactionary wars waged by Stalin, parenthesis, e.g., that waged yesterday in Poland, today in Finland, and tomorrow, ... The majority of the NC, which I think is National Committee, replies that no change whatsoever is necessary. Proceeding from here, the National Committee gave an evasive and ambiguous answer to the events in Poland. On the one hand, the majority of the National Committee, The majority of the National Committee gave an evasive and ambiguous answer to the events in Poland. On the other hand, the majority of the National Committee applied the term, quote, monstrous, end quote, to the invasion of Poland and stated that, quote, we don't support Stalin's invasion of Poland only because Stalin doesn't come for revolutionary purposes, end quote. Canon in Bulletin Number 3. On the other hand, the majority of the National Committee resisted all attempts to declare that we oppose all support to that war. All possible ambiguity has been removed from the position of the majority by the editorial in the appeal of December 1st, i.e. the article above, bracket, i.e. the article above, end bracket. Here we are told that if a war breaks out between bourgeois Finland and the Soviet Union, it is the duty of the Finnish workers to be Soviet partisans in the struggle. According to the majority, the military intervention of Stalin has the following results. 1. The military intervention of Stalin serves only the interests of the Kremlin and the Kremlin's ally Hitler. 2. The military intervention of Stalin is carried out without consideration of the will of the workers in the Soviet Union, in the world generally, or in the country affected. 3. The military intervention of Stalin disorients the international working class. 4. The military intervention of Stalin compromises the Soviet Union. 5. The military intervention of Stalin drives the Finnish workers into unity with the Finnish workers' own bourgeoisie. Therefore, support the military intervention. That is the conclusion of the majority. The majority seems to have discovered a progressive war, all of whose implications are clearly reactionary. We have always recognized the fact that Stalin's foreign policy bore a dual character and could be reactionary or progressive depending upon the precise circumstances. In this particular case, we have an example of the reactionary politics of Stalin carried out by war. The war is consequently reactionary. Our policy should be against support to either side. In effect, the majority argues that because the Soviet Union will be fighting a progressive war tomorrow, that therefore the majority must support the Soviet Union's reactionary war today. To revert to the trade union analogy, we would have to say this trade union is conducting a strike for reactionary purposes, e.g., for the ousting of all Negroes from the shops. But tomorrow, in the course of this strike, the union may be attacked by the bosses. Therefore, we must support this union's reactionary strike today. Such a policy is suicidal. Support to such a strike would compromise revolutionaries in the eyes of the Negro masses and would, in their minds, throw all the, quote, white, end quote, parties equally in the camp of the Jim Crow elements. Race chauvinism would be strengthened on all sides. Applied to Finland, this policy has the same results. If Stalin's war in Finland tends to make the Finnish workers cling to the Finnish workers' own boss class, our support to such a war would make the disease still worse. However, should the Soviet Union tomorrow become the victim of a general military offensive conducted by the imperialist powers of either camp, who would utilize this or any other reactionary move by Stalin as the pretext for beginning their attack on the USSR, it would be the duty of every worker to rally to the defense of the Soviet Union. But because Stalin may be fighting this progressive war tomorrow, is no reason to support his reactionary war of today. This would be incorrect, just as it would be equally incorrect to conclude that because Stalin conducts a reactionary war today, that we must discard our support to Stalin's progressive war of tomorrow. This piece was written by Herman Benson, but it was under the pen name of Ben Hall, and was originally titled "The Majority of the NC, Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 5, December 1939. That's the end of the piece. Thank you for listening. Hey everybody, this is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, edited by Sean Matt Gomna. The piece is titled, in this collection at least, what the original title is I will find out, but it's titled here, Finland, for Soviet Patriotism, Socialist Workers' Party, 1939. This is a statement of policy by the Political Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party, which was published in Socialist Appeal on the 9th of December, 1939. Finland, for Soviet Patriotism, Socialist Workers' Party, 1939. 1. The invasion of Finland by the Red Army is an incident in the Second World War which is now only in its tentative and initial stages of development. 2. The character of the Second World War is that of an imperialist struggle for the redivision of the earth. Despite present alliances or future changes in the alignment of the powers, the class antagonism between the imperialist states and the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state retains its full force. From this must follow an inevitable attempt on the part of the imperialists of one camp or another, or in a combination, to attack the Soviet Union in order to destroy the economic conquest of the October Revolution and open up the territory of the Soviet Union for capitalist exploitation. 3. Finland is not an independent small state fighting for Finland's independence against an imperialist power. Bourgeois Finland is and always has been a vassal state of the imperialists and an outpost of imperialism on the Russian border. 4. In the present conflict of the imperialist powers of the United States and Great Britain stand behind Finland and inspire Finland's foreign policy in relation to the Soviet Union. The diplomatic and propagandistic intervention of the Roosevelt administration on the side of bourgeois Finland is not motivated by, quote, humanitarian considerations, but by the class interests and future military designs of the Wall Street masters of the government. 5. Stalinist policy in the conflict with Finland is characteristic of Stalinist policy as a whole. The protection of the interests and privileges of the bureaucracy in utter disregard of the sentiments and interests of the world proletariat. The means and methods it employs to gain military and strategic advantages repel the sympathy and support of the workers and oppressed peoples, and thus undermine the real defense of the Soviet Union to such an extent as to outweigh by far the immediate military and strategic advantages that may be gained by the conflict with Finland. From this point of view, that is, the real defense of the Soviet Union against the imperialists. The Fourth International has always condemned the foreign policy of Stalinism and condemns the foreign policy of Stalinism in the present situation. The real defense of the conquest of the October Revolution requires, now more than ever, an unceasing struggle of the workers for the overthrow of the Stalinist bureaucracy by means of a political revolution. 6. Proceeding from the foregoing points, in accord with the program of the Fourth International, our basic attitude in the present military conflict between the Soviet Union and Finland is as follows. A. For the Fourth Internationalists in the United States, revolutionary defeatism, the main enemy is in our own country. No support, direct or indirect, to the imperialist government of the United States or the United States Finnish satellite. Expose and denounce the policy of Washington as political and diplomatic preparation for war against the Soviet Union. For the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, expose and denounce the methods of Stalinism which compromise the Soviet Union and weaken the Soviet Union's defense. B. For the Fourth Internationalist in Finland, revolutionary defeatism, the main enemy is in our own country. The first task of the Finnish workers remains an irreconcilable struggle for the overthrow of their own bourgeoisie. Not a man, not a gun, not a cent for the war of the Finnish bourgeois government against the Soviet Union. Work for the defeat of the Finnish bourgeois government in the war. Aim at the creation of an independent Soviet Finland, free from the domination of the Stalinist bureaucracy. If that is not possible in the immediate situation because of the unfavorable relation of forces political unpreparedness and military weakness, as is almost certainly the case in the present circumstances, utilized the defeat of the bourgeois Finnish army by the Red Army to arouse the masses to press forward for the complete expropriation of the Finnish capitalists and landlords immediately after the victory of the Red Army, organized for the maximum independence of the workers from the Stalinist bureaucracy and thus prepare its future overthrow. In the present military struggle, a victory of the Red Army is a, quote, lesser evil, end quote, than the victory of the Finnish puppet government of Wall Street in London. The Finnish Fourth Internationalists are partisans of an independent Soviet Finland and the irreconcilable foes of the treacherous and blood-splotched Kremlin bureaucracy and the treacherous and blood-splotched Kremlin bureaucracy's hand-picked Kuusinen regime in Finland. C. For the Fourth Internationalists in the Soviet Union, Soviet patriotism, the main enemy is world imperialism. Unconditional defense of the Soviet Union against the capitalist world. Only agents of imperialism standing for the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union can desire the defeat of the Red Army by the bourgeois Finnish outpost of the imperialist armies. Irreconcilable struggle for the overthrow of the Stalinist bureaucracy, which betrays the world proletariat and undermines the defense of the Soviet Union. Against the military bureaucratic annexation of Finnish territory. For the independence of Soviet Finland, unceasing criticism and exposure of the Stalinist methods of starting and conducting the war, but not the slightest relaxation of material and military support. The Fourth Internationalists in the Soviet Union will be the best soldiers in the Red Army and inspire the Red Army to victory over the imperialist bandits and the Stalinist betrayers. Again, this is a statement of policy by the Political Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party, Socialist Appeal, 9th of December, 1939. Hey dudes. This is a piece titled Invasion of Finland Serves Only the Kremlin. This is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, edited by Sean Matt Gamna. The piece was originally published in the Socialist Workers' Party, USA, obviously, Internal Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 5, December 1939. This piece is by the Socialist Workers' Party minority, which would go on to become the Workers' Party under the leadership of Max Shachtman following the 1939-40 split. 1. The editorial entitled The Kremlin's Aim in the Finnish Crisis, published in the December 1st issue of the Socialist Appeal, expresses openly a political capitulation to Stalinism. The main line of the editorial is concentrated in the sentence, quote, if a struggle breaks out between bourgeois Finland and the Soviet Union, it is the duty of the Finnish workers to be Soviet partisans in that struggle, end quote. Given this main line, the concrete circumstances of the invasion of Finland in the context of the present phase of the Second World War, all of the criticisms, modifications, and limitations included in the editorial serve only as pseudo-revolutionary embroidery to cover a policy which in that policy's fundamentals is in accord only with the aims and interests of the Kremlin and directly counter to the interests of the world revolution. This fact is indeed implicitly and unwittingly admitted by the editorial itself when the editorial writes, quote, that the Kremlin's military intervention serves only the interests of the Kremlin and the Kremlin's imperialist ally, parenthesis, Hitler in Poland, end parenthesis, that it is carried out without consideration of the will and feelings of the workers of the Soviet Union or of the occupied territories of the international proletariat, that it compromises the Soviet Union and disorients the world working class, ... end quote. If this is the meaning of the invasion, if it serves, quote, only, end quote, the Kremlin's interests, parenthesis, in other words, is against the interest of the revolution both in Russia and internationally, end parenthesis, on what conceivable grounds other than piety toward a vague, abstract, and outmoded formula of, quote, uncritical defense, end quote, is the world proletariat as to defend and support it. 2. To serve the utterly false policy of the National Committee majority, the appeal of December 1st has been consistently the case during the past 2 months, as has been the case consistently during the past 2 months, is compelled to distort and falsify the meaning and direction of current events. As its summary of a period, parenthesis, the last 2 weeks of November 1939, end parenthesis, which witnessed on every front intensification of the struggle between England and Germany, parenthesis, the German sea warfare in a new stage, the drastic British decision to control German exports, and above all the alteration of British speeches and propaganda to attacks on the German people instead of on the German government alone, as had been the case previously, end parenthesis. The appeal sees only a, quote, British bid to Germany aimed against the USSR, end quote. It remains true, of course, that the transformation of the present war into a war of combined imperialist assault against the Soviet Union remains possible, and it is undoubtedly the case that certain sections of the ruling class within every power are in favor of such a transformation. But to write as does the appeal that, quote, the nub of the war strategy of the great powers, end quote, is to bring about such a transformation is simply silly, since if this were indeed the, quote, nub, end quote, of the strategy of the powers, all the powers, the appeal declares, then not the present war, but the war against the Soviet Union would now be going on. The National Committee majority elaborates an abstract section of an ancient thesis instead of analyzing the actual war. 3. As in the case of Poland, so in the case of Finland, the Soviet Union continues integral participation in the imperialist war, acting on the one side as a partner in the Berlin-Moscow axis, on the other in furtherance of its own imperialist and expansionist aims. Finland, conquered, becomes a necessary strategic base, consolidates the Baltic against future attack, both from a defensive point of view and also, if the conquest is speedily and successfully completed, as protection in future expansionist moves either north into Scandinavia or west and south into the Balkans and Western Asia, the role of the Red Army in the Finnish invasion is reactionary, counter-revolutionary. 4. Reactionary also is the role of the Finnish bourgeois government and the bourgeois government's army, a government made up of the murderers of the Finnish workers and the stranglers of the Finnish Revolution, a slavish tool of British and U.S. imperialism. 5. From the analysis of the roles of the Finnish and Soviet governments and armies in the conflict follows, just as in the case of Poland or of the lesser Baltic states or of future similar episodes, the practical perspectives and tactical conclusions of the Fourth Internationalists with respect to the conflict. In general, the Fourth Internationalists internationally condemn, reject, and oppose both governments and their armies. We call in this conflict for the revolutionary struggle of Finnish and Russian workers against their own governments and the armies of those governments. For fraternization on the fronts, for the right of the Finnish people to genuine freedom and self-determination, a right made impossible alike by their own imperialist-dominated government and by the Kremlin bureaucracy, and for the realization of the objectives of the workers and the masses through the achievement of democratic workers' rule in both countries, and socialism, the realization of the progressive aims of the workers in both countries will in turn be guaranteed through the socialist United States of Europe. 6. The presumed difficulty or even impossibility of realizing such a perspective in the immediate present does not in the least militate against the necessity of putting it forward unambiguously, and now. Only in the light of such a perspective can the Finnish masses, and this applies only in a less acute degree to the masses of all capitalist and imperialist countries, even those not involved directly in military struggle, be turned from disparate refuge in their own bourgeois governments, toward which they are forced so brutally by the policy of Stalinism, and forced also in less blunt and open fashion by the policy of the National Committee majority, and the Russian masses guided toward an orientation where they, jointly with the masses of other countries, will gain the road of revolution. In the application of this perspective, the Fourth Internationalist will, of course, take into account concrete circumstances, the military situation, the moods of the masses, and also the differing economic relations in Finland and Russia. In Finland, they will strive wherever possible toward the expropriation of the big landlords and private industry, and the establishment of workers' control and the safeguarding of their rights and conquests from counter-revolutionary Stalinism and counter-revolutionary Stalinism's agencies. In Russia, they will fight against any tendencies towards reintroduction of private property and will aim to utilize every occasion for gaining democratic workers' control of the nationalized property. In both countries, they will continue the prosecution of the class struggle on all possible arenas, irrespective of the effects upon the military struggle. 7. The collapse of the Finnish bourgeois regime as a result of military reverses will, as in the case of the collapse of the Polish government, produce a movement toward independent workers' power, which can triumph under favorable conditions, primarily, however, on the condition of a rigidly independent class line of the Finnish proletariat. To advocate that the Finnish proletariat act as, quote, Soviet partisans, end quote, that is, as assistants of the Stalinist army, means to urge the strengthening of the forces that will act as the counter-revolutionary suppressor of any independent Finnish working-class movement or power, even if in the most elementary form. On the contrary, the revolutionist must encourage and give support to even the most embryonic tendency toward independent class action and the development of workers' power directed against the enemy at home, the Finnish bourgeoisie in the first place, and against the counter-revolutionary Stalinist invaders. 8. Within the United States, the main task of the Fourth Internationalist naturally remains the struggle against the main enemy, the enemy at home. In the case of the Finnish events, this means above all the exposure of the attempts of the administration and all schools of democratic imperialist patriots to exploit these events for the purpose of swinging the people behind the war aims of U.S. imperialism. The End. Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 5, December 1939. Howdy doody. This is a piece from the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, or was originally from the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 5, December 1939. The piece that I'm reading is from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, edited by Sean Nadgamna. The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism. This piece is by Albert Goldman, and it's under the title, it's titled, We Condemn the Invasion, We Defend the Soviet Union. I don't believe that title is probably from the original text, but that's how it's labeled in the book. Maybe it is the original title, I don't know. And Albert Goldman, according to Wikipedia, I'm just going to briefly run through it. You know what? Fuck it. I'll read the whole thing. Albert Goldman, 1897 to 1960, was a Belarusian-born American political and civil rights lawyer closely associated with the American Communist movement. Goldman broke with the mainline Communist Party USA in 1933, joining the Trotskyist opposition, in which Albert Goldman would be a leading participant for the better part of the next 2 decades. Albert Goldman is best remembered as a defendant and lead defense attorney in the 1941 Smith Act prosecution of the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party. For opposing America's involvement in World War II, Goldman was sentenced to 16 months in prison. Background. Albert Goldman was born of Jewish parents in 1897 in the Minsk Oblast of today's Belarus, then part of the Russian Empire. The family emigrated to the United States in 1904 when Albert was 7, settling in the Midwest metropolis of Chicago. Albert Goldman attended elementary and secondary school in Chicago before leaving for Cincinnati to study to become a rabbi at Hebrew Union College. Goldman left before completing his rabbinical studies and transferred to the University of Cincinnati, where he captained the collegiate basketball team and ran track. Following his graduation from college in 1919, Albert Goldman worked as a tailor. Albert Goldman came into contact with the radical movement in this occupation, first joining the Industrial Workers of the World, and shortly thereafter the newly formed Communist Party of America. Albert Goldman made use of the pseudonym, quote, Albert Verblin, end quote, under which name he wrote a polemic pamphlet answering a 1921 book by Socialist Party leader Maurice Hilquet entitled From Marx to Lenin. Albert Goldman went on to study at the Northwestern University Law School, from which he graduated in 1925. New section, Career, Communist Party USA. Following his admission to the Illinois State Bar, Goldman opened a legal practice in Chicago and began several years of close association with International Labor Defense, ILD, the legal defense organization of the Communist Party. On behalf of International Labor Defense, Goldman participated in a series of cases defending political radicals and trade union activists who had run afoul of the law. In 1931, Goldman made a trip to the Soviet Union, an experience which Albert Goldman found disillusioning. Albert Goldman's intellectual unease grew and he became connected with the Trotskyist opposition movement, leading to Goldman's expulsion from the Communist Party USA in 1933. New section, Trotskyism. After Albert Goldman's expulsion from the Communist Party USA, Albert Goldman joined the Communist League of America, CLA, the small Trotskyist opposition party, headed by James P. Cannon and Max Shachtman. Albert Goldman worked as an attorney on behalf of the Trotskyist movement, representing the CLA-led Minneapolis Teamster strikers in 1934. Albert Goldman was an early advocate of dissolution of the party and entrance into the Socialist Party of America in an effort to unite the anti-Stalinist left and to radicalize that organization. Albert Goldman was unable to win support for this position, however, so Albert Goldman severed his connection with the Trotskyists to himself joined the Socialist Party of America. In 1935, Albert Goldman established a mimeographed periodical called The Socialist Appeal as part of his effort to radicalize the Socialist Party. It was not long before Goldman's idea of entry into the social democratic movement in an effort to unite and radicalize it had won currency in the international Trotskyist movement in accordance with the so-called, quote, French term, the Trotskyists and their organizational allies associated with A.J. Must, who had worked together in a new organization called the American Workers' Party, dissolved the organization and entered the Socialist Party en masse. Goldman became the attorney for Leon Trotsky in exile in Mexico City and defended Trotsky there in April 1937 against the charges leveled against him by the regime of Joseph Stalin in hearings conducted before a commission headed by liberal educator John Dewey. Albert Goldman also served as an intermediary for Trotsky in the transfer of his personal and political archive to the library at Harvard University. Albert Goldman's Socialist Appeal became the semi-official organ of the organized Trotskyist faction in the SPA up until their expulsion in late 1937 and their establishment of a new organization called the Socialist Workers' Party in 1938. New section, Smith Act Trial. In 1941, Goldman was a defendant as well as a chief defense counsel in the Minneapolis trial of top Socialist Workers' Party leaders accused of violating the Smith Act, a prosecution pushed owing to the Socialist Workers' Party's continuing opposition to American participation in World War II. The defendants in this case were convicted and served prison terms ranging from 12 to 16 months. Goldman received a 16-month sentence. While in prison, Albert Goldman worked with Felix Marr to develop criticisms of the Socialist Workers' Party and Fourth International leaderships. They claimed that predictions of a revolutionary wave after World War II had been proved incorrect, and that Stalinism, far from being destroyed, as Trotsky had predicted, had been strengthened. Albert Goldman and Felix Marr also became critical of the party's organizational structures. Albert Goldman and Felix Marr were only able to convince a small minority of the party of their positions, although this included key figures including Jean van Heijenoort and James T. Farrell. Following his release from prison in 1943, Goldman found himself disbarred from legal practice. Albert Goldman was forced to establish a car rental business as a means of paying the bills while he worked for readmission to the Illinois bar. He would not be successfully reinstated to the bar until 1956, only a few years before his death. New section, post-war. After Albert Goldman's release from prison, Albert Goldman returned to his role among the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party. Albert Goldman gradually grew disenchanted, however, until in 1946, Albert Goldman and a small group of followers bolted the Stalin-led Socialist Workers' Party to join the rival Workers' Party headed by Max Shachtman from 1940. Albert Goldman ran for political office in 1947, entering the race to become mayor of Chicago with the support of the Workers' Party. Within the Workers' Party, Albert Goldman worked closely with James T. Farrell. In 1948, Farrell and Goldman developed criticism of the Workers' Party's policies, claiming that the party should support the Marshall Plan and also the presidential campaign of socialist Norman Thomas. The divergence of these views from the party majority proved to be the impetus for an exit from the Workers' Party in 1949. Albert Goldman became a nominal member of the Socialist Party following Albert Goldman's exit from the Workers' Party, but in practice the period of Albert Goldman's active participation in radical politics came to a close following his quitting of Shachtman's organization. New section, death. Albert Goldman developed health problems toward the end of the 1950s, leading to his death from cancer in 1960. Legacy. Albert Goldman's papers reside at the Wisconsin Historical Society located on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And as a list of his works here, they include The Struggle for Power from a Proletarian Viewpoint as Albert Verblin, New York Workers' Educational League, published in 1921. Charge, Rioting, Verdict, Not Guilty, a Plea to a Jury by Albert Goldman, attorney for the International Labor Defense. It's from 1932. From Communism to Socialism, a lecture delivered before the 6th Congressional Branch Forum of the Socialist Party of Cook County. It's from 1934. What is Socialism? 3 Lectures for Workers, published in 1938. The Assassination of Leon Trotsky, The Proof of Stalin's Guilt, published in 1940. Why We Defend the Soviet Union in 1940. The Truth About the Minneapolis Trial of the 28, Speech for the Defense, published with Pioneer Publishers, 1942. In Defense of Socialism, the official record of Albert Goldman's final speech for the defense in the famous Minneapolis, quote, sedition trial, published in 1942. And The Question of Unity Between the Workers' Party and the Socialist Workers' Party, from 1947. Okay, so now that we've listened to that, Albert, this is a piece, We Condemn the Invasion, We Defend the Soviet Union by Albert Goldman, 1939, and as we just learned, this is in his Socialist Workers' Party period, when he was in sympathy with the majority. Stalin's invasion of bourgeois Finland has brought greater clarity into the ideological conflict between the minority and the majority of our party. I hope no one of the minority will accuse me of justifying the invasion because of that. Regretfully, we must also admit that it has sharpened the conflict, for as the issues become clearer, the gulf between the groups grow wider. Up to now, we had to argue about implications of this or that formulation, of the use of this or that word or phrase. Up to now, we were confronted by a flood of hypothetical questions and pointless riddles, but now we are confronted with an actual situation when everyone is compelled to draw concrete conclusions from his theoretical position. No posing of riddles can help in taking a position in the actual struggle between the Soviet Union and an outpost of world imperialism. There were comrades who thought that because both the majority and minority could unite on condemning the invasion of Poland, the differences between the groups were not so serious and could easily be reconciled if only the organizational question could be settled. These comrades must understand now that the reasons given by the two groups for condemning the invasion were all important and indicated two fundamentally different attitudes to the Soviet Union and to Stalin's activities. The minority wanted to condemn the invasion because the invasion was an act of imperialism on the part of Stalin. The majority objected to the use of the term imperialism because such an absolutely un-Marxist use of that term imperialism could not but lead to absolutely incorrect policies. Condemn the invasion? Yes. But because the invasion violated the cherished principles of socialism, because it confused the masses, destroyed their confidence in the Soviet Union, and thus weakened the worker state. The important question was, from what point of view should the invasion of Poland be condemned? Sooner or later, events were bound to show that the political reasons advanced for condemning the invasion would lead to a different attitude on the question of defending the Soviet Union. Invasion of Finland brought a new factor into the situation, an actual war between the Soviet Union and capitalist Finland, inextricably connected with the imperialist world, and is this factor which brought to the surface and made explicit that which was concealed and only implicit in the Shachtman Resolution. No longer is it a question of what we meant by unconditional defense, but of defense itself. It is, first of all, necessary to understand clearly the issue between the majority and minority on the invasion of Poland. Both groups condemn the invasion. Both groups are for a policy of revolutionary defeatism in Finland, for the overthrow of the Finnish bourgeoisie and establishment of a Finnish Soviet Republic. Both groups also agree that if the Finnish workers should succeed in establishing a Soviet Republic, the Finnish workers should struggle against Stalin's army for an independent Soviet Republic. There's also no difference between the groups on the question of the necessity of continuing the struggle within the Soviet Union for the overthrow of Stalin. We all recognize that it would aid the Soviet Union tremendously if the Soviet bureaucracy were overthrown by the Russian workers under the leadership of the Fourth Internationalists. The question that divides the groups is the question of defeatism or defensism within the Soviet Union. The question as to what position the party should take as to the victory or defeat of the Soviet army fighting against the Finnish bourgeois army before the Finnish workers established a Soviet Workers' Republic or before the Russian workers overthrow Stalin. The minority resolution takes a position of defeatism within the Soviet Union. The term defeatism is not found in the resolution, but the idea of defeatism is clearly stated in the last sentence, which asserts that within the Soviet Union, as well as in Finland, the workers should, quote, continue the prosecution of the class struggle on all available arenas, irrespective of the effects upon the military struggle, end quote. This is essentially the definition of defeatism adopted by the Fourth International and applied thus far to the policy which workers should follow in an imperialist country when that country is at war. The minority wants to apply it also to the Soviet Union, which the Fourth International considers a workers' state. It is characteristic both of the confusion and the unprincipledness of the minority that the minority attempts to change fundamental principles of our international incidentally to the adoption of a policy on a particular question. There is nothing wrong in advocating a change of our fundamental principles, but one must do so openly and not attempt to introduce such a change via a word or phrase in a resolution which does not in so many words advocate the abandonment of the present programmatic principles and the adoption of new programmatic principles. It has, for instance, been the position of the Fourth International that the Stalinist bureaucracy is not a class in the Marxist sense of the term. In one sentence of a short resolution, the minority smuggles in the idea that the struggle of the Russian workers against the bureaucracy is a class struggle in the same sense that the struggle of the workers against the capitalist class in a capitalist country, thus transforming the Soviet bureaucracy into a stroke of the pen. Until the minority seriously attempts to prove to us that the Soviet Union is an imperialist state in the Marxist sense of the term, and that the bureaucracy is a class in the Marxist sense of the term, we shall not argue the question. We have taken a contrary position on the basis of a very thorough analysis and an exhaustive discussion, and it is up to those who want to change our minds to produce some new facts and arguments. Here it is merely sufficient to note that the minority's position on Finland is based essentially on the concept that Stalin follows an imperialist policy, and that therefore our attitude in the Soviet Union should be similar to, if not identical with, the attitude of the workers in any capitalist imperialist country. As another justification of the policy of defeatism within the Soviet Union, the minority bases itself on the principle that Stalin is waging a reactionary war. Without any concrete analysis whatsoever, the term, quote, reactionary war, end quote, is hurled at us by the comrades of the minority in a sort of triumphant manner, as if the term in and of itself immediately solves all problems. The argument runs as follows. We support only progressive wars. We do not support reactionary wars. The Soviet Union under Stalin in invading Finland is conducting a reactionary war. Hence our policy should be one of defeatism in the Soviet Union. Thus, instead of a Marxist analysis, we have terms thrown at us such as reactionary and progressive. Is the invasion of Finland by Stalin's Red Army reactionary? We can say, yes it is. But does that solve the problem for us? It does not, for we cannot substitute a word for a Marxist analysis. In what way is it reactionary? Is it reactionary in the same way as the attack of imperialist Italy on Ethiopia or of Japan on China? Is it reactionary because it is an attack of an imperialist country on a colonial or semi-colonial country? Obviously not. It is reactionary because the invasion goes counter to all the best sentiments of the masses, confuses the masses, and thus weakens the Soviet Union and the world revolution. But a Marxist cannot stop there. The Marxist must take all factors into consideration. What role is Finland playing? What is the actual character of the struggle? What part is world imperialism playing in it? The minority admits that Finland is a tool of British and American imperialism. The majority, taking all factors into consideration, concludes that the war between the Soviet Union and Finland, in spite of Stalin's crime in invading Finland, is actually a struggle between imperialism and the workers' state. And once we analyze the struggle as one between the workers' state and imperialist nations, our slogan of unconditional defense comes into play. That is, we defend the Soviet Union, quote, from the blows of the capitalist enemies, irrespective of the circumstances and immediate causes of the conflict, end quote. That's a quote from War and the Fourth International. Yes, we are for a Soviet Finland, we are for the overthrow of Stalin, but we cannot and dare not be indifferent to the outcome of the actual struggle of the moment. As against the armies of bourgeois Finland fighting the battles of the imperialist world, we prefer and we shall work for the victory of the Red Army, which, in spite of everything, is the army of the degenerated workers' state. Some comrades of the minority point to what they deem to be a gross contradiction in our attitude. We unreservedly condemn the invasion, and at the same time we call upon the workers to support the Red Army as against the Finnish bourgeois army. Comrade Ben Hall, in his article, The Majority of the National Committee, makes a big point of this. After enumerating, I think Ben Hall was the name of Yeah, it was yeah, that was the name of, what the hell is his name again? Herman Benson. That's what Herman Benson was writing under. Comrade Herman Ben Hall, who's Herman Benson, in his article, the majority of the National Committee makes a big point of this. After enumerating the criticisms which the majority levels at Stalin's invasion of Finland, he continues in a sarcastic vein, quote, therefore support the military intervention. That is the conclusion of the majority, end quote. Note, Comrade Hall, in the first place it is not therefore, and in the second place we do not support the intervention. To put it plainly, in spite of Stalin's crime in invading Finland, under the circumstances that Stalin did, we shall work for the victory of the Red Army against the Finnish bourgeois army representing imperialism. Why? Because in a war against imperialism, whatever the cause of the war, the consequences of a defeat of the Red Army by an imperialist army can be very grave indeed to the nationalized property. The working masses must at all times reserve for themselves the right and the privilege to destroy the Stalinist bureaucracy. We must, with all means at our disposal, prevent the destruction of that bureaucracy by the imperialists. The comrades of the minority become exceedingly irritated when we use the analogy of a trade union to illustrate our attitude to the Soviet Union and the Stalinist leadership. It is quite correct that an analogy does not prove anything, but the analogy shows how the person using the analogy looks at the whole subject. For us, the worker state is nothing but a very large trade union. That is why we constantly use the analogy. The only valid reason for objecting to the analogy of the trade union is that the Soviet Union is not a worker state. But once you admit that it is a worker state, the Soviet Union is a worker state, then the trade union analogy is absolutely perfect. Comrade Hall, however, accepts the analogy and on the basis of the analogy tries to prove that the majority is wrong. We could not, he says, support a strike of a trade union to exclude Negroes from a factory. That is correct, but let's examine the analogy a bit further. What did Stalin, the reactionary leader of the trade union, want from Finland, the little boss representing, in this instance, the big bosses? He wanted certain islands and a peninsula, Hago, for the purpose of assuring the defense of Leningrad. The object of Stalin, therefore, is not to exclude Negroes, but to get certain positions from the boss in order to be in a better position to ward off a possible attack. What did Stalin, the reactionary leader, do when the boss refused to grant his request? He did what many reactionary trade union leaders do on many occasions. He attacked the boss in such a way as to alienate the sympathy of everyone, including the workers themselves. Therein lies his crime. But once he committed that crime, for which we must condemn him without any reservations, he involved the Union in a strike against the bosses, and in that strike no revolutionist can possibly be neutral. Stalin's objective was not bad. The way he attempted to realize it is very bad, because even if Stalin achieves the objective, Stalin has weakened the Union by alienating the sympathy of the workers. Let us take the analogy from a different viewpoint. Let us consider the objective bad. That is, let us consider that Stalin is actually calling a strike to exclude Negroes. In which case we could not possibly support Stalin. But whatever Stalin's motives may be, the strike actually developed into a struggle between the bosses and the Union is in danger of destruction at the hands of the bosses. No revolutionist will permit the bosses to destroy the Union, even though the calling of the strike was for a purpose which he could not possibly support. If we are right in considering the Soviet Union on a worker state, though degenerated, and if we are also right that Finland represents an outpost of imperialism, then it follows, as night the day, that in spite of everything we must prevent the defeat of this Red Army at the hands of the Finnish bourgeois army. There are many comrades of the minority who are playing around with the idea that a defeat of the Red Army is to be preferred because that will lead to a revolution against Stalin. They cite Lenin as authority for the proposition that a defeat of one's own imperialist army is preferable because it will create conditions favorable for a revolution. The difference is that Lenin dealt with a struggle between imperialist camps, but the same property relations in both camps, and under those conditions the workers can and must be utterly indifferent to the fate of their own imperialist state. It's kind of like hilarious to me, because like the thing that's like so funny about like this to me is that if you actually are in favor, we're in favor, like seriously, in a serious way, for a political revolution under Leninist or Trotskyist or Bolshevik Leninist leadership against the Soviet Union, do you not think that that would weaken the USSR internationally if there was a conflict, a serious conflict between the working class under Trotskyist leadership and the Stalinist bureaucracy? Do you not think that that would weaken the USSR? Like, that seems completely bizarre to me. If your whole thing is defending the USSR, then defending collectivized property, and this imperialist threat from a state as small as Finland, obviously has support, I guess, tended like some kind of support, which would lead the entire world of Western imperialism to overcome their differences and invade the Soviet Union. If like the state was really that weak, then if it would like lost a skirmish on its border, or lost an invasion of it was repelled. If you think that the loss of that an invasion by a state being repelled would cause the entire institution of collective nationalized property to be thrown into jeopardy, why do you think that wouldn't be the case if there was an attempted political revolution against in the Soviet Union? Do you not think that the West would try to exploit that? And like, wouldn't a political revolution, especially if it wasn't just as quick as as ideally someone might want it to be, if that was actually a protracted civil war between one segment of Russian society and another, do you not think that would put the entirety of the Soviet state in a very vulnerable international position? Like, that seems like super ridiculous to me. I don't know. I mean, and that was the kind of the whole, and it was a very small thing, right? That was the justification for the putting down of Kronstadt, right? Which was completely the bloodbath, whatever. I mean, I supported Kronstadt. I support the goals of Kronstadt, but taking the argument that it was actually taking the argument that in the grand scheme of things, relatively small insurrection put the entirety of the USSR in such a state of jeopardy. If that was the reason for putting it down, wouldn't any kind of revolution in the Soviet Union, especially with the increasing tensions of war becoming a possibility, wouldn't any kind of revolution against the Stalinist state, political, social, or otherwise, cause considerable problems for the state? Yeah, that seems like to think that a political revolution against Stalinism wouldn't cause instability that Western powers wouldn't try to take advantage of, or I don't know. It just seems like a very, I mean, I'm not a deep expert on the subject matter, but that just seems kind of like a ridiculous idea to me. The Soviet army losing in Finland would destabilize USSR and empower Western imperialism. Attempted political revolution in the USSR would not do that. I don't know. I would think that for instance, a civil war happening in the United States, as you're talking about in the era of the Vietnam period, for instance. I don't know. These aren't good analogies. I don't know. I have to think more about the strength of these analogies. But the United States losing the Vietnam War did not put it at substantial risk of being defeated by, say, the Soviet Union or China or any of its opponents that would have liked to seen the United States destroyed. The idea that a state losing a expansionist war would automatically, open the floodgates to it being taken over is a very strong position, which I don't think holds up. Yeah. I don't know. I don't remember where I was stopped at. Where the hell am I? I'll just read this paragraph. I might have read it already. Let us take the analogy from a different viewpoint. Let us consider the objective bad. That is, let us consider that he is actually calling a strike to exclude Negroes, in which case we could not possibly support him. But whatever his motives may be, the strike actually developed into a struggle between the bosses and the union is in danger of destruction at the hands of the bosses. No revolutionist will permit the bosses to destroy the union, even though the calling of the strike was for a purpose which he could not possibly support. If we are right in considering the Soviet Union a workers' state, though degenerated, and if we are also right that Finland represents an outpost of imperialism, then it follows as night the day that in spite of everything we must prevent the defeat of the Red Army at the hands of the Finnish bourgeois army. There are many comrades of the minority who are playing around with the idea that a defeat of the Red Army is to be preferred because that will lead to a revolution against Stalin. They cite Lenin as authority for the proposition that a defeat of one's own imperialist army is preferable because it will create conditions favorable for a revolution. The difference is that Lenin dealt with a struggle between imperialist camps and the same property relations in both camps, and under those conditions the workers can and must be utterly indifferent to the fate of their own imperialist state. The workers must concentrate on the struggle to overthrow their own capitalist government, and if this leads to the defeat of their own imperialist army, that risk must be taken. And, after all, is it not such a great risk? Why? Because even assuming the best possible variant, that is, assuming that the opposing imperialist army will overrun the country and defeat not only the bourgeoisie but also the revolution, there would be only a change of master under the same property relations. It may conceivably happen that a defeat of the Red Army by a bourgeois army would lead to a revolutionary movement among the masses, but the far greater probability is that such a defeat would give heart to every counter-revolutionary element within the Soviet Union and encourage the imperialists in attempting to smash the workers' state once and for all. A defeat of an imperialist army creates a revolutionary movement amongst the masses. A defeat of the army of a workers' state, no matter how degenerated, would set the counter-revolutionary elements in motion. Can anyone point to many cases where strikes have been broken by the bosses and the trade union completely defeated, and where as a result the revolutionary elements came to power immediately after the defeat? All the arguments lead to one conclusion. If you believe in the Soviet Union as a workers' state, and you analyze the present conflict as one between the Soviet Union and an important outpost of imperialism, then the application of our slogan of unconditional defense must apply, regardless of the crimes of Stalin. The workers and not the imperialists must punish and destroy the Stalinist bureaucracy. Again, this is the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 5, December 1939. Hey everyone, this is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, edited by Sean Matt Gamna. This piece is titled Hue and Cry About Poor Little Finland, or at least that's how it's titled in the book, and it's by Max Shachtman in 1939. At the bottom of the text it says this is from the quote, "In This Corner" column in Socialist Appeal, 16th of December 1939. Almost everybody is joining the pack in a hue and cry over poor little Finland. Mr. Hoover is collecting funds. President Roosevelt is granting a moratorium on the Finnish debt. Congressmen are yelping for a break-off of relations with Russia. Alexander Kerensky is stoutly for the independence of Finland. The Finnish White Guards in this country are loading recruits for Finland onto ships, and the Liberals and Social Democrats are pouring out a sea of tears on which to float the ships. The rear guard is brought up smartly by Norman Thomas, bracket, of the U.S. Socialist Party, and bracket, an editor of his official organ, who are ready to fight it out for Finland to the death. Without exception, all the, quote, friends of Finland, end quote, are serving one objective, the whipping up of a chauvinistic war spirit for the, quote, democratic, imperialist, and for American participation in the world slaughter on their side. As we recall it, Mr. Kerensky, head of the Russian Provisional Government some 20 years ago, was then not quite so strenuous in his demand for the independence of Finland from Muscovite rule. In fact, Kerensky fought both the Bolsheviks and the Finnish nationalists who demanded the right of self-determination for Finland. We further recall that it was the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Trotsky who, as soon as they were in power, promptly granted Finland its independence. Mr. Kerensky's love for Finland is a little, how shall we say, belated. We do not recall any very vigorous activity on the part of Messrs. Hoover, Roosevelt, and Co. on behalf of Albania, Ethiopia, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Spain, and other victims of reactionary assault. When the imperialist gangsters were cutting up the world map to suit themselves, and without bothering to inquire of the wishes of those they were carving into greater empires, we heard barely a whisper from all the congressmen, statesmen, and other illustrious citizens of our great democracy. They did not then demand the breaking off of diplomatic relations with Italy or Germany, and for good reasons. Mussolini and Hitler were, after all, only doing what every imperialist nation, the United States included, has done throughout its existence and continues to do. But didn't the, quote, liberals and, quote, socialists of the new leader and the nation and the socialist call protest then? Yes. They protested when the fascist bandits carried out their abominations, but not even from them was there a word of protest against the similar abominations of the, quote, democratic bandits. Not a murmur, for example, when France so graciously ceded to Turkey the Syrian province of Alexandretta a short time ago, purely for the purpose of winning Turkey to an alliance with Anglo-French imperialism. The people of Alexandretta, non-Turkish in their majority, were of course not consulted by either the Turks or the French, nor any more than the Syrians as a whole ever were consulted about being put under the heel of the French army and the French banks. The protestations of our great American patriots and warmongers, from Hoover through Roosevelt to Jerry Allard, who sound a spot more convincing if they preface their activity by a declaration that their first and main fight is against the violation of national independence and sovereignty, which is perpetuated by their own ruling class, that is to say, by American imperialism in Puerto Rico, Samoa, the Philippine Islands, and elsewhere. And once they made such a declaration, it would be obligatory for them to add a similar statement with reference to their allies, that is, to those on whose side they are asking us to fight, England and France. They would have to say, it seems to us, that before they presume to say a word in protest against the violation of Finland's independence by Stalin, they denounce the continuing violation of the independence of India, Indochina, Syria, Algiers, most of Africa, and all other colonies, protectorates and, quote, spheres of influence, end quote, of British and French imperialism. It goes without saying that they will do nothing of the kind. They are too busy working up the campaign for American participation in the war to bother with such trifles. How does the fate of a few 100 million Indians compare with so noble and idealistic a goal as making the world safe for democracy a second time? It's all very clear and simple. You can commit any crime in the calendar of Stalin or Hitler or Mussolini on one condition: you call yourself a Democrat. It will not only sanctify whatever you do, but constitute an unlimited license to condemn your opponent in world politics for doing exactly the same thing. Again, this was from the quote, "In this corner column, Socialist Appeal, 16th of December, 1939. I think I'm probably going to release this piece with just like other pieces from this section, because they kind of all like bounce off of each other very nicely, actually, and are probably all responding to each other. So it might make sense for me to put these all up as one video as opposed to a bunch of different ones. But that's the end of that piece. Thank you for listening. Hey everyone. This is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, edited by Sean Matt Gamna. This piece is titled In Finland, Essentially Stalin Was at War with Imperialism, by Albert Goldman, 1940. That title is probably not the title of the original piece, which this content originally comes from. Let's see what it was originally from. Doesn't have any other title, but it says it's from the Militant, 23rd of March, 1940. So here we go. In Finland, Essentially Stalin Was at War with Imperialism, by Albert Goldman. I'm not sure, again, it'll probably be annoying to hear this again, but I'm not sure if I'm going to release these videos all separately, these pieces all separately, or put them all together, because they kind of all respond to each other, and kind of like listening to one in isolation, I don't think would be as fruitful as listening to them all together, even if the video is longer and I can't fit all the names of the participants in the title. But here we go. Our party in the resolution dealing with the invasion of Finland by the Red Army from Socialist Appeal at December 9th, characterized that invasion as an incident in the Second World War. That is what it turned out to be, an incident which ended by the achievement of peace before it became the beginning of a major conflict between the Soviet Union and Allied imperialism. That the invasion did not develop into an open conflict between English and French imperialism and the Soviet Union is primarily due to the fact that Stalin's chief aim is to keep from being involved in a major war. That is what explains the Hitler-Stalin pact. The only enemy Stalin feared was Hitler, who, of all the imperialists, had the best chance to attack the Soviet Union. A pact with Hitler would, Stalin thought, do away with the possibility of an immediate war. He was undoubtedly of the opinion that England and France would not go to war over the invasion of Finland, and if they did, he could avoid being involved in such a war. As his compensation for relieving Hitler of the danger of facing enemy armies on Germany's eastern borders, Stalin received from Hitler guarantees in the form of territorial concessions in Poland and the Baltic countries, which makes the Soviet frontier more easily defended. The Hitler-Stalin deal in 1939 included secret clauses agreeing Russian domination in the Baltics. In September-October, Stalin pressured those states into accepting Russian military bases. In 1940, he would invade and annex them. End bracket. Why does Stalin want to avoid a major war? Because war threatens the rule of the Stalinist bureaucracy, either through revolution or through a successful attack of one or more imperialist countries. But if Stalin wants to avoid a major war, why did Stalin invade Finland? Because Stalin's demands on Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania having been granted, Stalin could not afford to permit Finland to defy him. Stalin's prestige was at stake, and, besides, Stalin was anxious to take advantage of the general situation to increase his defensive strength. Stalin undoubtedly thought that he could settle matters with Finland very quickly. Against whom is Stalin trying to defend himself? Primarily against Hitler, for it must not be presumed that Stalin is so stupid as not to see that if Hitler is successful against the Allies, the Nazi war machine will turn to the east. The creation of the Kuusinen puppet government (for Finland) is evidence of the fact that Stalin at first thought of taking all of Finland. A few days after the invasion, in the early days of December, the Finnish government made a plea through Sweden to the Kremlin to renew negotiations. The Kremlin on the 5th of December haughtily informed Sweden that there was no Finnish government other than the People's Government of Kuusinen, with whom the Soviet government had already, quote, made, end quote, a treaty. However, when Stalin found that his army, led by a general staff which he had decapitated and demoralized, could not repeat the exploits of Hitler's army in Poland, and that as a result there was a real chance of his being involved in a war with the Allies, he beat a retreat from his original purpose. After the Red Army cracked the Mannerheim line (of Finnish fortifications), Stalin was willing to call a halt, settle with the same Finnish government which Stalin refused to recognize in December, and thus avoid an attack by the Allied armies. The Russo-Finnish War ended on the 13th of March 1940 with a deal in which Finland ceded 11% of its territory to Russia. Was it merely the Finnish capitalist army that was defeated? In coming out for the defense of the Soviet Union, and for the victory of the Red Army as a lesser evil to the victory of the Finnish capitalist army, we took the position that essentially the Soviet Union was at war with the imperialist forces standing behind Finland. It was clear to us that Finland could not have decided to resist Stalin's demands without the encouragement of Chamberlain, Daladier, and Roosevelt. It was clear to us that Finland could not have held out so long without receiving substantial aid from the outside. Only when Finland was ready to capitulate did Chamberlain and Daladier reveal how much armament material they had actually sent, and how much more material and how many men they were ready to send if Finland would only keep fighting. Our assertion that Finland was fighting the battle for imperialism was completely confirmed. The cracking of the Mannerheim line would by itself be a sufficient reason for the Finnish government to accept peace terms. True, the Allies offered to send 100,000 men and all the material necessary to withstand the attack of the Red Army, but in view of the time that it would require to get these men over to Finland, and especially in view of the refusal of Sweden and Norway to permit transit facilities, the Finnish government saw no possibility of accepting that offer. And then it was certain, as Prime Minister Ryti informed the Finnish Diet, that to accept the offer of the Allies would mean to invite Germany to send Germany's armed forces into Finland, and they could get there faster than the Allied forces. That meant that Finland would become one of the major battlefields of the war. The Finnish bourgeoisie preferred at this juncture to get peace by surrendering to Stalin the strategical frontiers that he had demanded. The Finnish bourgeoisie had refused to grant Stalin's demands when originally made only on the mistaken assumption, undoubtedly based on promises made to them by the Allies, that the Allies were going to declare war against the Soviet Union as soon as the invasion began. Why did not France and England openly declare the Soviet Union at the beginning and immediately send a huge army to aid Finland? It must be recognized that there were serious practical difficulties in the way, chief of which was the attitude of the Swedish and Norwegian governments, unwilling to see their countries become a battleground. Nor must it be forgotten that, while the contradiction between imperialism and the Soviet Union is real and fundamental, there are also inter-imperialist rivalries at this particular moment. Those rivalries are in the forefront. British and French imperialism are of the opinion that if British and French imperialism can take care of German imperialism, British and French imperialism will have no difficulty in settling scores with the Soviet Union. Of course, if British and French imperialisms conclude that, in order to get at German imperialism, French and British imperialism must attack the Soviet Union, British and French imperialism will not hesitate to attack the Soviet Union and try to kill two birds with one stone. To defend his government against the charge of cowardice in not joining Finland, Christian A. Günther, Swedish foreign minister, showed that the Allied proposal to send troops to Finland was designed more for the purpose of getting at Germany than to assure Finland's independence. To a certain extent, Günther is correct, but another primary motive of the Allies in sending troops to Finland would be to inflict a defeat on the Red Army if possible, and if not, to keep Stalin busy so that he would not be in a position to help Hitler. It can be presumed that not only did Hitler agree to peace between the Soviet Union and Finland, but Hitler was actually pressing for it. While Hitler's general aim is to involve Stalin in a military conflict with the Allies, Hitler obviously is of the opinion that, at this particular moment, Stalin can be of greater service to Hitler if the Soviet Union is at peace. Hitler was also anxious to avoid war in Sweden, for hostilities in Sweden meant a chance of having his supply of iron ore and other material cut off. Nor is Hitler very anxious to see Stalin entrench himself too strongly in the Baltic, for Hitler realized that any increase in the defensive strength of the Soviet Union makes his future task all the more difficult. However, Hitler's all-important problem is to defeat the Allies. Hitler is perfectly willing to grant Stalin defensive positions if thereby the Nazi war machine can achieve its main purpose at this moment. It would be folly to deny that the defensive position of the Soviet Union in a military sense has been strengthened, but it would be greater folly not to realize that the defense of the Soviet Union depends primarily not upon military strategic factors, but upon the sympathy of the masses throughout the world. Through the invasion, Stalin brought discredit upon the Soviet Union. Stalin destroyed the sympathy of the masses for the Soviet Union and tied the masses more firmly to the capitalist world. The loss to the Soviet Union because of that is far greater than the gains achieved in a military strategic way. No one except the misled people who blindly follow the Stalinist parties believe the absurd statement made by the Kremlin that Finland threatened to invade the Soviet Union, and no one except those same people believe now that the Soviet-Finnish peace treaty is a tremendous victory for peace, as is claimed by Moscow and of course by the communist parties and daily worker. If and when the Allied imperialists should succeed in defeating Hitler and proceed with settling accounts with Stalin, or if the Allies should decide to invade the Soviet Union before defeating Hitler, it will be 1,000 times more difficult to arouse the masses in opposition to such a war. Stalin has destroyed the faith of millions in the Soviet Union, and once more has shown that the Stalinist bureaucracy is weakening the Soviet Union. Millions of workers do not make the distinction that should be made between the Stalinist bureaucracy and the Soviet Union. Stalin acts in the same manner as Hitler, and from that, millions of workers draw the false conclusion that the Soviet Union is the same as Germany. We condemned the invasion because we knew beforehand that no matter what victories the Red Army would gain, the Soviet Union would lose in the esteem of the working masses, because the masses, repelled by the invasion, would tend also to become indifferent or even hostile to the Soviet Union. But we were staunch in our defense of the Soviet Union and favored the victory of the Red Army against the Finnish capitalist army representing the imperialist world. Recognizing that nationalized property still exists in the Soviet Union, we must defend the Soviet Union in any war against a capitalist nation. All that one has to ask is, what would have been the result of a defeat of the Red Army in Finland? Nationalized property would have been endangered, and that is what we defend both against imperialism and against the Stalinist bureaucracy. Has not the Stalinist bureaucracy strengthened itself because of the victory of the Red Army? Perhaps yes, temporarily, but would not the Soviet Union be in danger if the Soviet Union had been defeated? We repeat that what we have said 1,000 times. The task of destroying the Stalinist bureaucracy is a privilege and a duty which the workers must reserve for themselves, and not assign to the imperialists. How will those profound theoreticians, the Socialist Party, the Lovestonites, a splinter from the Communist Party, former supporters of Bukharin, and their similars, justify their theory of Stalinist imperialism? Undoubtedly, they will make all kinds of gyrations to show that they are correct. But anyone who is not blinded by hatred of Stalin can easily see what Stalin is primarily after is to obtain defensive footholds. It is well nigh impossible to explain what he has done thus far on the basis of the theory that he has entered into a partnership with Hitler to divide the British Empire, or even some have said it, the whole world. Of course, people do not have to consider facts. They can let their desires and imaginations run away with them. But then these people are not Marxists. And when the Supreme Council of the Soviet Union will meet, it will undoubtedly nationalize industry in that section of Finland ceded to the Soviet Union by the peace terms. It is true that this will be done in a bureaucratic manner, and to that extent it is not what we want. But as against permitting industry to remain under capitalism, even bureaucratic nationalization is progressive. Let the middle-class Democrats howl about, quote, Stalinist imperialism, end quote. But Marxists will continue to make a distinction between imperialism and a degenerated worker state which, when it annexes territory, takes property away from the imperialists and narrows the basis of world imperialism. No one can say with certainty when and under what conditions the Soviet Union will find itself at war. All that our party states is, whenever the Soviet Union will be at war with any capitalist country, we shall call upon the workers in the world to defend it, because in doing so we are defending the first conquest of the world revolution. For workers everywhere, the main enemy is imperialism. The workers must do their utmost to destroy the power of the Stalinist bureaucracy, precisely in order to defend the Soviet Union most effectively. This is from The Militant, the 23rd of March, 1940. Thanks for listening. Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Taking Stock of the Russo-Finnish War. This is from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, edited by Sean Madgamna. It's by Leon Trotsky, 1940. It's from the manifesto of the Emergency Conference of the Fourth International, May 1940. It's titled Taking Stock of the Russo-Finnish War. I don't know if I said that already. And here we go. Stalin's alliance with Hitler, which raised the curtain on the World War and led directly to the enslavement of the Polish people, resulted from the weaknesses of the USSR and the Kremlin's panic in face of Germany. Responsibility for this weakness rests with no one but this same Kremlin, this Kremlin's internal policy, which opened an abyss between the ruling caste and the people. This Kremlin's foreign policy, which sacrificed the interests of the world revolution to the interests of the Stalinist clique. The seizure of Eastern Poland, a pledge of the alliance with Hitler and a guarantee against Hitler, was accompanied by the nationalization of semi-feudal and capitalist property in Western Ukraine and Western White Russia. Without this, the Kremlin could not have incorporated the occupied territory into the USSR. The strangled and desecrated October Revolution served notice that it was still alive. In Finland, the Kremlin did not succeed in accomplishing a similar social overturn. The imperialist mobilization of world public opinion, quote, in defense of Finland, end quote, the threat of direct intervention by England and France, the impatience of Hitler, who had to seize Denmark and Norway before French and British troops appeared on the Scandinavian soil, all this compelled the Kremlin to renounce Sovietization of Finland and to limit itself to the seizure of the indispensable strategic positions. The invasion of Finland unquestionably aroused on the part of the Soviet populace profound condemnation. However, the advanced workers understood that the crimes of the Kremlin oligarchy do not strike off the agenda the question of the existence of the USSR. The USSR's defeat in the World War would signify not merely the overthrow of the totalitarian bureaucracy, but the liquidation of the new forms of property, the collapse of the first experiment in planned economy, and the transformation of the entire country into a colony, that is, the handing over to imperialism of colossal natural resources, which would give it a respite until the Third World War. Neither the peoples of the USSR nor the world working class as a whole care for such an outcome. Finland's resistance to the USSR was, with all its heroism, no more an act of independent national defense than Norway's subsequent resistance to Germany. The Helsinki government itself understood this when it chose to capitulate to the USSR rather than transform Finland into a military base for England and France. The Helsinki government itself understood this when the Helsinki government chose to capitulate to Hitler rather than transform Finland into a military base for England and France. Our wholehearted recognition of the right of every nation to self-determination does not alter the fact that in the course of the present war, this right does not have much more weight than thistledown. We must determine the basic line of our policy in accordance with basic and not tenth-rate factors, the theses of the Fourth International. State, quote, the concept of national defense, especially when it coincides with the idea of the defense of democracy, can most easily delude the workers of small and neutral countries, Switzerland, partly Belgium, Scandinavian countries. Only a hopelessly dull bourgeois from a god-forsaken Swiss village, like Robert Grimm, can seriously think that the world war into which he is drawn is waged for the defense of Swiss independence. These words today acquire a special meaning. In no way superior to the Swiss social patriot Robert Grimm are those who believe that it is possible to determine proletarian strategy in relation to the defense of the USSR through reliance upon such tactical episodes as the Red Army's invasion of Finland. According to Wikipedia, Robert Grimm lived from 1881 to 1958 and was the leading Swiss socialist politician during the first half of the 20th century. As a leading member of the Social Democratic Party of Switzerland, he opposed the First World War. Robert Grimm was the main organizer of the Zimmerwald movement and the chairman of the International Socialist Commission in Bern from 1915 to 1917. After the Grimm-Hoffmann affair, Robert Grimm had to resign from this function. Robert Grimm was the leader of the Swiss general strike in November 1918. The demands of the strike included the 48-hour working week, old age pensions, and women's suffrage. In April 1919, a military tribunal sentenced Grimm to 6 months in prison for calling on soldiers to refuse orders to open fire on the strikers. Robert Grimm was among the founders of the International Working Union of Socialist Parties. Robert Grimm held various parliamentary seats and executive functions from communal to federal level between 1909 and 1955. In 1946, Robert Grimm became president of the Swiss National Council. Back to the text. Only a hopelessly dull bourgeois from a god-forsaken Swiss village like Robert Grimm can seriously think that the world war into which he is drawn is waged for the defense of Swiss independence. These words today acquire a special meaning, in no way superior to the Swiss social patriot Robert Grimm, or those who believe that it is possible to determine proletarian strategy in relation to the defense of the USSR through reliance upon such tactical episodes as the Red Army's invasion of Finland. Extremely eloquent in its unanimity and fury, was the campaign that the world bourgeoisie launched over the Soviet-Finnish War. Neither the perfidy nor the violence of the Kremlin prior to this had aroused the indignation of the bourgeoisie, for the entire history of world politics is written in perfidy and violence. Their fear and indignation arose over the prospect of a social overturn in Finland upon the pattern of the one engendered by the Red Army in eastern Poland. What was involved was a fresh threat to capitalist property. The anti-Soviet campaign, which had a class character through and through, disclosed once again that the USSR, by virtue of the social foundations laid down by the October Revolution, upon the existence of the bureaucracy itself is dependent, still remains a worker state, terrifying to the bourgeoisie of the whole world. Episodic agreements between the bourgeoisie and the USSR do not alter the fact that, quote, taken on a historic scale, the antagonism between world imperialism and the Soviet Union is infinitely deeper than the antagonisms that set the individual capitalist countries in opposition to each other, end quote. Many petty bourgeois radicals who only yesterday were still ready to consider the Soviet Union as an axis for grouping the, quote, democratic, end quote, forces against fascism have suddenly discovered, now that their own fatherlands have been threatened by Hitler, that Moscow, which did not come to their aid, follows an imperialist policy, and that there is no difference between the USSR and the fascist countries. Lie. Will respond every class-conscious worker. There is a difference. The bourgeois appraises this social difference better and more profoundly than do the radical windbags. To be sure, the nationalization of the means of production in one country, and a backward one at that, still does not ensure the building of socialism, but it is capable of furthering the primary prerequisite of socialism, namely the planned development of the productive forces. To turn one's back on the nationalization of the means of production on the grounds that in and of itself it does not create the well-being of the masses is tantamount to sentencing a granite foundation to destruction on the ground that it is impossible to live without walls and a roof. The class-conscious worker knows that a successful struggle for complete emancipation is unthinkable without the defense of the conquest already gained, however modest they may be. All the more obligatory, therefore, is the defense of so colossal a conquest as planned economy against the restoration of capitalist relations. Those who cannot defend old positions will never conquer new positions. The Fourth International can defend the USSR only by the methods of revolutionary class struggle. To teach the workers correctly to understand the class character of the state, imperialist colonial workers, and reciprocal relations between them, as well as the inner contradiction in each of them, enables the worker to draw correct practical conclusions in situation. While waging a tireless struggle against the Moscow oligarchy, the Fourth International decisively rejects any policy that would aid imperialism against the USSR. The defense of the USSR coincides in principle with the preparation of the world proletarian revolution. We flatly reject the theory of socialism in one country, that brainchild of ignorant and reactionary Stalinism. Only the world revolution can save the USSR for socialism. But the world revolution carries with it the inescapable blotting out of the Kremlin oligarchy. Had the Kremlin government expressed the real interests of the workers' state, had the Comintern served the cause of world revolution, the popular masses of tiny Finland would inevitably have gravitated toward the USSR, and the invasion of Poland. Had the Kremlin government expressed the real interests of the workers' state, had the Comintern served the cause of world revolution, the popular masses of tiny Finland would inevitably have gravitated toward the USSR, and the invasion of the Red Army either would not have been necessary or would have been accepted at once by the Finnish people as a revolutionary act of emancipation. In reality, the entire previous policy of the Kremlin repelled the French workers and peasants away from the USSR. While Hitler has been able to count upon the assistance of the so-called, quote, fifth column in the neutral countries he invades, Stalin did not find any support whatever in Finland despite the tradition of the 1918 insurrection and the long existence of the Finnish Communist Party. Under these conditions, the invasion of the Red Army assumed the character of direct and open military violence. The responsibility for this violence falls wholly and indivisibly upon the Moscow oligarchy. Again, this is excerpted from the Manifesto of the Emergency Conference of the Fourth International, May 1940. Invasion of Baltics, a defensive move against Germany, by Felix Mara, 1940. This is from a piece titled Stalin Moves into Baltic Countries, or was originally a piece titled Stalin Moves into Baltic Countries, published in Socialist Appeal, 22nd of June, 1940. The complete occupation and transformation into military camps of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia by Soviet troops last weekend was almost universally recognized as a move inspired by fear of Hitler. With France out of the war, the Nazi armies completely dominated continental Europe, able to turn and rend the partner whose, quote, peace and friendship treaty, end quote, freeing Hitler from any worry about a fight on two fronts, had so enormously facilitated the Nazis' speedy victory, bracket, in Western Europe in May-June 1940, end bracket. Occupation of the tiny Baltic states provided certain strategic advantages in case of hostilities with Germany, but these seemed pitifully paltry as contrasted with the enhanced power of Nazi Germany, now as compared with last August when Stalin encountered the, quote, peace, end quote, pact with Hitler. From Stockholm, it was reported by Otto Tolicius of the New York Times that, quote, Germany makes little secret of her displeasure, end quote, at the Soviet move. Almost the only source that did not characterize the step as a defensive move against Germany was the Stalin regime and the Stalin regime's Stalinist press abroad, for Stalin could not admit now, any more than when Stalin sought strategic bases in Finland, that Stalin was seeking protection against the consequences of his, quote, peace pact of last year. Then he had justified the pact on the ground that it was made impossible a German war against the Soviet Union. The advantage of the pact, Stalinists had argued throughout the world, outweighed all its evil consequences. Now less than 10 months after the pact, Stalin could not admit that he was convulsively adding to his defense to guard against that which his pact with Hitler was to have made possible. Since the Stalin cult of infallibility precluded telling the truth, the occupation of the Baltic states had to be justified by preposterous lies. The official Soviet communiques solemnly declared that the Lilliputian slates had, quote, prepared an attack on the Soviet garrisons, end quote, stationed there. The Baltic states could very likely play the role of puppets of a great power, preparing an assault upon the Soviet Union. But with the Allies cracking under Hitler's blows, the only great power which could be manipulating the Baltic puppets would be Germany, and that Stalin could not admit, for it would condemn his entire policy. Hence his absurd lies which convince no one and which rather further discredit the Soviet Union in the eyes of the world's workers. It does not require an admission from Stalin to establish the utter bankruptcy of the Stalin-Hitler pact. When the Nazis marched on Poland, Stalin counted on a second Munich, bracket, i.e. British and French acquiescence, end bracket, as the most likely aftermath. On the day the German troops marched, Molotov smiled skeptically when the Polish ambassador told him that France and England would fulfill their commitments to Poland, quote, we shall see, end quote, said Molotov unbelievingly. Neither Molotov nor his master had understood that the European crisis had gone too far for a second Munich. The only possibility which occurred to the Kremlin minds was that, If war did come, it would be of long duration. Precisely the Stalin-Hitler pact, however, wiping out the possible danger of a war on two fronts, enabled Hitler to concentrate all the war power of the German economy in the West to assure a short war. Stalin's intelligence service undoubtedly acquainted him with the fact that Hitler's military machine actually believed in the reality of the Blitzkrieg timetable which Hitler was publicly enunciating, and with August 15th as the outside date for successful completion of the European phases of the war. But Stalin did not use this information to reorganize his policy. Stalin followed that policy out to its dead end. And what a dead end. Never in the worst days of the War of Intervention of 1918 to 20 was the infant Soviet Republic in a more dangerous position than is the Soviet Union today, thanks to Stalin's strategy. The labor movement, which Lenin considered to be the most important bulwark defending the Soviet Union, lies crushed under Hitler's war machine as the end result of Stalin's foreign policy. Lenin said the Soviet Union must take advantage of the contradictions between the imperialist powers. Instead, Stalin let himself be used first by one imperialist power, then the other. Lenin said the Soviet Union must take advantage of the contradictions between the imperialist powers in order to advance the world revolution. The only real safeguard of the Soviet Union. Stalin permitted himself to be used by the imperialist powers to crush one after another the labor movements of Europe. In 1936, in the name of the, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, provided by the Franco-Soviet Pact, Stalin's French lieutenants prevented the revolutionary June strikes from culminating in a complete social revolution. Instead, they told the workers to be good French patriots, to surrender the factories, and to obey the coalition with the bourgeoisie. The Popular Front government of Blum-Daladier, that government and that government's successors, backed by the Stalinists, broke the back of the French working class. Hounded and denuded of its gains and rights, the French workers could scarcely be inspired by the French bourgeoisie to hurl back Hitler. The same French Popular Front government of Blum-Stalin refused to provide arms to the Spanish loyalists. Meanwhile, the Spanish Popular Front government, created by the Stalinists, broke the morale of the Spanish workers and peasants by forcing them to dissolve their factory, land, and soldiers' committees, forced them to limit their struggle against Franco within the impotent confines of bourgeois democracy. To achieve this foul end, Stalin's GPU assassinated the flower of the Spanish revolutionists, all this in Stalin's vain attempt to establish his respectability and to win the goodwill of British imperialism. Instead, the British facilitated Franco's victory, and another labor movement was wiped off the map. Having perpetrated all this evil without adding a particle to the security of the Soviet Union, Stalin then sought protection in the pact with Hitler, with what results we have now seen. Neither to the British workers, nor to the American, nor to any other labor movement left in the world can Stalin turn with any assurance of aid in this moment of terrible danger to the Soviet Union. Millions upon millions of workers who before that were ready to defend the Soviet Union would not turn a hand for the Soviet Union now. After the Hitler-Stalin Pact and the invasions of Poland and Finland, our prediction that the defensive positions gained by the pact and the invasions would not compensate in any way for the loss among the workers of their former faith and trust in the Soviet Union has been verified. That and the crushing of the European labor movement by Hitler's victories leave the Soviet Union bereft of all outer defenses. The Soviet Union could endure as an isolated worker state in a capitalist world for 23 years, thanks only to the fact that Europe was not a capitalist unity, but was divided by imperialist rivalries. Now Hitler is in the process of unifying Europe on the most reactionary basis imaginable. The Soviet Union is confronted by a united capitalist Europe. This is the end of Stalin's road of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. Stalin and the, quote, realists, end quote, who rallied to him turned their back on the dream of world revolution and concentrated on a, quote, practical, end quote, task. At every stage, the interests of the world revolution, of the world working class, were subordinated, were sacrificed to the needs of the Soviet Union, so they said, and this is the result. If Stalin remains at the helm of the Soviet Union, he will bring it to destruction at the hands of the imperialists we have predicted. The truth is here now for all to see. The masses of the Soviet Union, if they are to save themselves and the nationalized economy from imperialist assault, one must overthrow Stalin. The destruction of the Stalinist bureaucracy is an absolute necessity for the Soviet Union. Only a revolutionary internationalist policy and a revolutionary leadership capable of inspiring the world working class to a new effort can save the Soviet Union. Again, this was originally a piece titled Stalin Moves into Baltic Countries in Socialist Appeal, 22nd of June, 1940. Baltics, reactionary annexation by labor action. This is originally from a piece from Labor Action titled Molotov Says Russia Assures Germany of Security in East. It was from Labor Action, the 12th of August, 1940. The quote, good neighborly friendly relations between the Soviet Union and Germany are not based on fortuitous considerations of a transient nature, end quote, declared Russian Premier Molotov in a speech to the Supreme Soviet on August 1st, quote, but on fundamental state interests of both the USSR and Germany, end quote. In a brief review of the past months of the war and the position of the Soviet Union, Molotov endorsed the remarks of Hitler on the 19th of June that English speculations on conflicts between the two allies were baseless. Molotov affirmed that the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939, quote, removed the possibility of friction in Soviet-German relations when Soviet measures were carried out along our western frontier, and at the same time, it has assured Germany a calm feeling of security in the East. The developments in Europe, far from reducing the strength of the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, on the contrary, emphasized the importance of its existence and further development, end quote. Already, Molotov continued, Russia has annexed, quote, all by peaceful means, end quote, parenthesis, exclamation point, end parenthesis, territories of the population exceeding 23 million people, and has shifted its western frontiers to the Baltic coast, quote, of first-rate importance for our country. At the same time, we shall have ice-free ports in the Baltic, of which we stand so much in need, end quote. Molotov. The end of the war is not yet in sight, Molotov stated, but, quote, true to its policy of peace and neutrality, the Soviet Union is not taking part in the war, end quote. This hypocritical, quote, neutrality, end quote, is coupled with further threats against Finland, Iran, and Turkey. As to Finland, quote, naturally, if certain elements in the Finnish ruling class do not cease their persecution of public circles in Finland, parenthesis, that is, the recently organized Stalinist, quote, left wing, end quote, in the Finnish Social Democratic Party, end parenthesis, which are striving to strengthen the good neighborly relations with the USSR, then relations between the USSR and Finland may suffer damage, end quote. Molotov. And the fate of the Baltic countries foreshadows what Stalin and Molotov planned for Finland. Reactionary annexation. On the pretext that the Baltic governments had formed a military alliance against Russia, the Soviet government demanded, in the words of Molotov, quote, changes in the governments of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and dispatched additional Red Army units to these countries, end quote. These states, following fraudulent army-controlled, quote, elections, are now incorporated in the Soviet Union. I'll be out in a minute. Molotov's speech indicated that, despite antagonisms between the reactionary expansionist interests of Russia and Germany and Italy, about which he was completely silent. The Soviet Union in the next period will continue its foreign policy in accordance with the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Again, this was from Labor Action, August 12th, 1940. Bessarabia, a worker state, has a right and a duty. Bessarabia, a worker state, has a right and duty to extend its base. By Albert Goldman, 1940. This is from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, edited by Sean Matt Gamna. Like I said, I'm going to put all these videos together. It's probably going to be really irritating to hear, actually, me saying that over and over again, but I started recording these one at a time, and so I feel the need to continue to do that, but I also feel the need to say that I plan on doing that. So, all right, let's go. This was originally titled Romania May Have Heralded Stalin's Policy Switch. Romania move may herald Stalin's policy switch. Jesus Christ. Socialist Appeal, 6th of July, 1940. Taking advantage of Hitler and Mussolini's preoccupation with their task of dealing a knockout blow to the British Empire, Stalin demanded and obtained the return of Bessarabia, the province which Romania had seized from the Soviet Union in 1918. The fact that, together with Bessarabia, Stalin obtained the northern part of Bukovina is almost conclusive evidence that Stalin's demands were motivated by a desire to prepare defensive positions against the attack which everyone expects Hitler to launch against the Soviet Union as soon as he is through with, or as soon as he makes peace with, England. If it is true that Stalin is also demanding control of the mouth of the Danube, it would only strengthen the theory that Stalin is trying to seize as many defensive positions as Stalin possibly can while the seizing is good. To gain control in the Danubian estuary would be bearding Hitler in his den. Did Hitler know of and acquiesce in Stalin's actions? Speculation is rife as to whether there was an agreement between the two permitting Stalin to take Bessarabia and Bukovina, or whether Stalin took what he wanted without asking his, quote, friend, end quote, Hitler. The statement issued by the German legation in Bucharest to the effect that the occupation of Bessarabia was instigated by Cripps, the British ambassador to Moscow, and nothing but a British trick to involve the Balkans in the war, conflicts with the attitude of the Berlin officials, which is that the whole matter is one entirely between the Soviet Union and Romania. The inference of this difference between Bucharest and Berlin is that Stalin acted without as much as notifying Hitler. This inference is strengthened by the haste with which the Germans in the occupied territories made their exit. But the answer to the question as to what extent the move in Romania was into Romania was made by Stalin with the knowledge and consent of Hitler does not affect its defensive character. That is, that primarily it constitutes a further preparation of Stalin to defend himself against Hitler. The sudden dispatch of tens of thousands of troops into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia a few weeks ago was clear evidence that Hitler's phenomenal success has Stalin considerably worried. It is the defensive aspect of the move by Stalin as against Hitler that will keep the petty bourgeois Democrats of all varieties from going into hysterics and demanding either that the quote democracies take strong action against the Soviet Union or else that the Bessarabian workers take up arms against the Red Army. When Stalin sent the Red Army into Finland, it constituted an invasion of a quote small democratic nation, end quote, and the petty bourgeois Democrats reacted so violently that they were willing to take up arms to help defeat the Red Army. Some also claim an intention to use their arms against the Finnish army, but all were for the defeat of the Red Army. But the petty bourgeois Democrats cannot get all heated up about Romania as the petty bourgeois Democrats did about Finland. Although a small country, it can hardly be classed as a democracy. We can therefore expect that the quote Democrats of all types, while ceremoniously referring to their theory of Stalinist imperialism and of the partnership between Hitler and Stalin to divide the British Empire, if not the whole world, will, however, not raise much of a howl, all of which indicates the democratic roots of their opposition to the Soviet Union. As for us, we shall continue to state that a worker state has a right and a duty to take advantage of the conflicts and difficulties of the imperialist world in order to extend the worker state's base and strengthen the worker state's defensive positions. And we shall continue to attack the bureaucratic methods of the bureaucracy of the degenerated worker state when these methods alienate the sympathies of the working masses and thus nullify the gains made by virtue of the acquisition of territory and defensive outposts. To the Bessarabian workers and peasants we say, join your brothers in the Soviet Union in the struggle against imperialism against the Stalinist bureaucracy. And it becomes clearer with the passing of every day that all of the decisive positions acquired by Stalin cannot possibly compensate for Stalin's crime in entering into the pact with Hitler. Stalin thereby not only lost the support of millions of workers who consider the Soviet Union as the champion of the struggle against fascism, but he also enabled Hitler to gain complete control over Europe, making certain of an attack by Hitler on the Soviet Union without the slightest fear of any interference by France. The factor of contending imperialist states on the European scene, a factor of tremendous importance to the safety of the Soviet Union, has been wiped out by the pact and by the consequent victory of Hitler. That Stalin realizes the danger of Stalin's situation is evidenced not only by Stalin's movement of troops, but by a more or less clearly indicated change of line on the part of the Stalinist parties, a change of line that has a meaning only if Stalin is cautiously preparing a shift towards the, quote, democracies, end quote. For the past 2 months or so, the Stalinists have been attacking German imperialism as well as Allied imperialism, and now the Stalinists have launched a campaign against the Munich men in the English cabinet and for a people's government to continue the struggle against Hitler. It may not be long before the Stalinists will discover that there has been such a change in the constitution of the English government that to support the, quote, democracies, end quote, against Hitler will become the sacred duty of the working masses. Again, that's from a piece titled Romania Move May Herald Stalin's Policy Switch. Socialist Appeal, 6th of July, 1940. The next piece is titled Stalin Seizes Eastern Romania for Revenues, Power, and Prestige by Joseph Carter, 1940. This is originally from a piece titled Russia's Occupation of Romania Extends Hitler-Stalin Balkan Hold. This is from Labor Action, 8th of July, 1940, and it's abridged. With the complete approval of Hitler and Mussolini, Russian troops occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina following a 24-hour ultimatum to the Romanian government calling for the ceding of these territories. Hitler gained control over Romania and the Balkans, as King Carol accepted the ultimatum and renounced the guarantee of protection pledged a year ago by Anglo-French imperialism. The country is now facing complete dismemberment as Hungary demands the return of Transylvania, a province taken from her after the First World War, and Bulgaria asks for Dobruja, a province seized from Bulgaria in 1913. Hitler will decide how and when these demands will be met. At some point, the Russian troops clashed with the Romanian army because of the rapid occupation of the ceded territory, and according to reports, because they went beyond the frontiers established by the agreement, apparently by mistake. Fighting also broke out between Stalinists released from prison and local police, and as a result of the increased anti-Semitic drive in Romania, which caused Jews to flee to Russian-occupied territory. At the same time, there are persistent reports that Stalin has demanded from Romania naval bases at Constanța, I don't know, Constanza, and at the mouth of the Danube, and from Turkey, participation in control of the Dardanelles, the narrow straits linking the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. These reports, although not confirmed, are in harmony with the general course of the Hitler-Stalin alliance. The official Russian explanation for its new annexations are given in Molotov's ultimatum note of June 26. The communique declares that the Soviet Union has never reconciled itself to the seizure of Bessarabia by Romania at the end of the last World War. It claims that the overwhelming majority of the people of that province are Ukrainians and should therefore be united with the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. This change, it continues, is made both possible and necessary by the new military strength of Russia and the, quote, present international situation, end quote, and is connected with the need of transferring to Russia northern Bukovina, whose people are bound to the Soviet Union by language and national composition. At the same time, the transfer of this province would also be a partial compensation for the 22-year domination of Bessarabia by Romania. The note concludes by demanding the two provinces within 24 hours by June 27th, ... Hitler permits these seizures of territories by Moscow as compensation for Hitler's, quote, for Stalin's, quote, non-belligerent support of Hitler's war against Anglo-French imperialism, and as a means for his own further control of the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. While Hitler wages war in the Western Front, Russia stands as a threat over Turkey and the Balkan countries, above all Romania, in case they should decide to join the Allies against Germany. Turkey, whose control over the Dardanelles gives it a unique position in the Mediterranean and the Near East, has been forced to break its alliance with England and France. Romania had to follow suit. Now Hitler controls that country, and with the aid of Stalin aims to dominate the Dardanelles. While Hitler is conducting his war against the British Empire, Russia will assure the regular flow of goods from the Balkans to Germany. Stalin's aid to Hitler flows from his own desire to increase the revenues, power, and prestige of the reactionary bureaucratic rulers of Russia. His interests have nothing in common with those of the Russian or the world working class. Through his partnership with the most powerful and aggressive imperialist power, German fascism, Stalin has taken over part of Finland, the Baltics, parts of Finland, and now Bessarabia and Bukovina. Like Russian Tsarist imperialism, Stalin seeks control over the Dardanelles, and with that, influence in the Mediterranean and the Near East. He is ready to share this expansion with German fascism, and in order to do so, seeks to make Hitler as dependent on Russia as possible. At the same time, these new conquests will become defense outposts in case of a German attack on Russia. Stalin is working hard for the long-term agreement with German fascism. Hitler has probably promised Stalin such a lasting division of the spoils. Naturally, neither partner trusts the other, and in case of a quick and decisive victory of Hitler over the British Empire, particularly if there is not an immediate war between Germany and the United States, Hitler will turn to Russia and seek to reduce it to a colony. Despite apparent strengthening of Russia's defenses, Stalin's entire course has in reality weakened the country. His barbaric dictatorship over the Russian people, the wiping out of the old generation of revolutionists, the suicidal purges of the Red Army officer staff, the economic chaos which has resulted from his bureaucratic economic, quote, planning, his brutal crushing of the national independence of the bordering states, and his destruction of the growing revolutionary working class movements in Germany in 1932 to 33 and in France 1934 to 39 have all contributed to repelling the masses and weakening the Soviet Union. At the same time, by his support of Hitler's war against Anglo-French imperialism, Stalin has strengthened German fascism in German fascism's struggle for world domination and has thereby increased the danger of a successful Hitler attack on Russia. Within Russia itself, new measures were adopted last week for increased production in preparation for large-scale military operations. The 8-hour working day replaces the 7-hour working day. The 7-day week is substituted for the 6-day week, with a revolving rest day, so that while every worker gets 1 day of rest in 7, factories will operate on a full 7-day schedule. At the same time, warnings were issued against the growing trend among workers to leave their places of employment without permission, and heavy penalties decreed. Undoubtedly, the turnover of labor is far greater than officially admitted, and is the expression of an increasing dissatisfaction among the workers with the existing labor standards and terroristic conditions. Commenting on these decrees, Pravda, on June 26, recalls the words of Stalin that, quote, the whole of our people must be kept in a state of mobilization and preparedness in the face of the danger of military attack, so that no single, quote, accident and no tricks on the part of our external enemies may take us by surprise, ... end quote. However, it should be remembered that every adventure of Stalin, such as in Finland or in the Baltics, was undertaken under the guise of, quote, defense of the Soviet Union. Stalin is now preparing for large-scale warfare as an ally of Hitler if the German Führer permits, or against Hitler if and when Hitler decides that he no longer needs Russian collaboration and turns on his ally of today. Whatever course Stalin takes will be dictated by Stalin's own reactionary anti-working class, anti-socialist interests. The Russian workers and peasants, supported by the workers of other countries, can defend their country against Hitler and capitalist imperialism only by the relentless struggle for the overthrow of the Stalin regime and for socialist democracy. Again, that was an abridged reprinting of a piece titled Russia's Occupation of Romania Extends Hitler-Stalin Balkan Hold from Labor Action, 8th of July, 1940. The next piece is titled Iran, Not All Invasions Are Bad by Albert Goldman, 1941. This is originally published as The Marxist Attitude on Iran Invasion, published in The Militant, 6th of September, 1941. To some people, all violence is hateful. The violence of the master against the slave is to be condemned, and also the violence of the slave who attempts to free himself from the master. When British imperialism uses violence in India to keep millions of people in subjection, the moralists who are above the social conflict in society protest. They would also protest if the Indian masses should use force to drive the British rulers out of India. People who argue that way have some abstract standard of good and evil, a standard that ignores classes and class struggle. The Marxists never evaluate the activities of classes and nations from some abstract moral standard, but the needs of classes and nations to achieve their freedom. Are all invasions bad? The Marxist answer to that question is in the negative. He replies, who is doing the invading and who is being invaded? What are the circumstances of the invasion? Does it further the interests of the revolutionary working masses? The Soviet Union invades Iran, and British imperialism invades Iran. Middle-class moralists who think every invasion, no matter by whom or against whom, or under what circumstances, is an imperialist act, rise in their righteous indignation to condemn both. The Marxists say the Soviet Union is a worker state, although a degenerated worker state. The Soviet Union is fighting for the Soviet Union's existence against German imperialism. The Soviet Union is under an obligation to take every measure necessary for the Soviet Union's defense, provided it does not conflict with the interests of the world revolution. The Soviet government issued a statement in connection with its invasion of Iran, justifying the act on the ground that Article 6 of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921 gives it the right to march troops into Iranian territory in order to take necessary military measures whenever the Iran government is unable to prevent an attack or a threatened attack on the Soviet Union through Iran. The treaty with Iran was made under the regime of Lenin and Trotsky and is significant of the attitude of the leaders of the Russian Revolution. It took to the possibility of marching troops into a territory that did not constitute part of the Soviet Union. In the interest of defending the Soviet Union, they demanded and obtained the right to send their armed forces into an adjacent country. The treaty does not require the Soviet Union to obtain permission from Iran before sending troops. It can be taken for granted that Lenin and Trotsky would have sent troops into neighboring territory even without permission, and even without a treaty, if the interests of the Soviet Union and the world revolution demanded such action. It is quite true that British imperialism was the enemy that the Soviet government had in mind at the time of the treaty, but the fact that German imperialism is the enemy of that now threatens the Soviet Union, makes not a particle of difference. And neither is the fact that, because of a particular military situation, the British imperialists are invading Iran at the same time that the Soviet Union is doing so, of the slightest importance insofar as determining the right of the Soviet government to send its troops into Iran. But did we not condemn the Stalinist government for invading Poland, Finland, and the Baltic countries? Yes, we did, but only because under the circumstances the damage done to the Soviet Union, because the act of invasion alienated the sympathies of millions of people, was greater than any benefits that could be derived from the compulsory annexation of the territories invaded. Lenin and Trotsky would have been compelled to weigh advantages and disadvantages in undertaking an act like invading another country. They would have made the necessity for such an invasion clear to the workers of the world, and above all, the masses would have had complete confidence in their motives and in their promises. No one can deny that Stalin's act in invading Iran is viewed with great suspicion. That is because the policies that he has been and is following have justifiably created suspicion as to his motives, and very few people believe in his promises. All his explanations and excuses for invading Poland and Finland were of no avail to the vast masses whose invasions appeared in the same light as Nazi invasions. Stalin's crime consisted of exactly this, that he made the Soviet Union appear to be in the same category as Nazi Germany. Although we Trotskyists knew that Stalin had annexed part of Poland and the Baltic countries and part of Finland for military strategic reasons to prepare against an attack by Hitler, still we condemned the invasion because the loss of faith in the Soviet Union on the part of millions of people outweighed by far the possible military advantages. We are not overconfident that Stalin will abide by his promises to withdraw the Red Army from Iran when the necessity for its occupation will have disappeared. That is something to be settled in the future. At present, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, the class-conscious workers and peasants, including those of Iran, will not permit anything to interfere with the defense of the Soviet Union. This is from a piece called The Marxist Attitude on Iran Invasion. I might have misspoke before. Did I misspeak? No, I didn't. I just didn't say what it was originally from. Next piece is titled The Iran Imperialist Aggression. New International, 1941. After the first round of cheers from the liberals for England because she has, quote, finally adopted Hitler's technique of attacking first and explaining afterward, they have settled down to the more sober and embarrassing problem of elucidating that what one of them calls the, quote, ethics, end quote, of the invasion of Iran. At bottom, the elucidation is admirable in its simplicity. When German imperialism does it in the name of self-defense, in the name of preventing the enemy from converting the country in question into a base of war operations, in the name of the, quote, new order, end quote, it is uniformly bad. When British imperialism does it in the name of self-defense, in the name of preventing the enemy from converting the country in question into a base of war operations, and what's more, in the name of, quote, democracy, end quote, is uniformly good and deserves to find favor in the sight of the Lord. The modern version of non-olet is, quote, oil doesn't stink, end quote. In a word, we have here only another of those sordid cases of purely imperialist aggression which requires a copious supply of shamelessness among its apologists. In none of the hundreds of cases that soil the pages of modern history have the invasion and occupation of the weaker and usually defenseless country been accompanied by assurances that it is all being done for the benefit of the country itself. In most of the cases, the imperialists add that if they hadn't done it, some other bandit would have. This is always a great relief to the victim. The case of Iran, however, is somewhat, quote, complicated, end quote, by the Soviet Union's participation in the invasion, as were the invasions of Poland, the Baltic countries, Finland, and Romania in the first stage of the war. At that time, all species of apologists for Stalinism were no less shameless than they are now. Then, it is true, the invasions were effected in concert with German imperialism, but the apologists explained confidently that Stalin was really not sharing the loot with Hitler, but preventing Hitler from doing more looting. And this, between you and me, laying the basis for an attack on Hitler. Anyway, Poland was an imperialist state and Mannerheim a butcher of the people, parenthesis, which Stalin is not, end parenthesis, bracket, Mannerheim was Finland's military commander in the 1939-40 war under a social democrat/liberal government. Mannerheim had also been the military leader of the counter-revolutionary whites in Finland's Civil War of 1918, end bracket. Anyway, it is necessary to defend unconditionally the Soviet Union. In August 1941, the Kremlin apologists feel a little easier. Not less shameless, but a little easier. In the first place, Stalin is acting in alliance with a very nice, popular, suave, democratic bandit, instead of with a most unpopular fascist bandit. And in the second place, somebody managed to dig up, glory be, a sanctifying document, a genuine one this time, not forget or anything like that, is nothing less than the Russo-Persian Treaty. Yes, that treaty does indeed exist. It was signed in Moscow on the 26th of February 1921 by Chicherin and Karakan for the Russian Soviet Republic and by Moshe Viral Mamelek for the Persian, now Iranian government. The ghost of Lazovsky, who now functions as head of the Soviet Information Bureau, quoted truthfully from Article 6 of the treaty, which provides that, quote, ... in the case of attempts made on the part of third countries to pursue an annexation policy by means of an armed intervention on the territory of Persia, or to transform the territory of Persia into a base for military operations against Russia, and if thereby the frontiers of the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic or the states allied with it should be threatened, and the Persian government, following a warning on the part of the Russian Soviet government, should not possess the necessary strength to ward off this danger, the Russian Soviet government is empowered to direct its troops into the territory of Persia in order to adopt the necessary military measures in the interests of self-defense. After the elimination of the danger, the Russian Soviet government obligates itself to withdraw its troops immediately from the territory of Persia." End quote. What would Stalin have done if he didn't have this wonderful Article 6 from way back in 1921? Why, Stalin would have done exactly what he did in Poland and in the Baltic countries and in Finland and in Romania, for which he had no Article 6 or anything like it. But whatever you say, Stalin does have it now, doesn't he? Stalin does, and every apologist for Stalinism, including most of his allies in the democratic imperialist camp, are effusively delighted. An imperialist invasion without an Article 6 is all right in its way. An invasion with it is almost wonderful. But before the word there was the deed, and before Article 6 of the treaty there was Article 2, which Lazovsky, not having sufficient time on the radio, was not able to quote. It reads as follows, quote, "The Russian government stigmatizes the policy of the governments of the Tsarist Russia, which, without the agreement of the peoples of Asia and under the cover of guaranteeing the independence of these peoples, concluded treaties relating to the Orient and other countries of Europe, whose objective was a gradual annexation. The Russian Soviet government rejects unqualifiedly this criminal policy, which not only violated the sovereignty of the countries of Asia, but also led to an organized, brutal violation of the living body of the peoples of the Orient by the European robbers. Accordingly, and in correspondence with the principles set forth in Articles 1 and 4 of the present treaty, the Russian Soviet government declares its renunciation of participation in any measures which aim at weakening or violating the sovereignty of Persia, and declares that all conventions and agreements between the former government of Russia and third states injurious and relating to Persia are abolished and nullified." End quote. Thus, the necessary precondition for fulfilling the Russian obligation under Article 6 of the treaty in alliance with British imperialism was the violation of Article 2, both in letter and in spirit. Iran is only another and even clearer proof of the inadmissibility of the cry for the, quote, "defense of the Soviet Union," end quote, in a war which the Soviet Union is allied with an imperialist camp, and by virtue of its control and direction of the reactionary Stalinist regime, is conducting a reactionary imperialist war. Imperialist war? Yes. And Iran is an even plainer case than was Poland. It is a war of joint imperialist expansion on the part of Churchill and Stalin, according to the simple and exact description by Lenin, who wrote on the 24th of February 1918, not of capitalist imperialism alone, and in particular, but of imperialism in general. Quote, "I characterize here as imperialism the robbery of other countries in general, and as imperialist war a war of robbers for the division of the booty," end quote. Lenin. That was from a piece, the end. That was a piece from titled "Stalin in Iran," which was an editorial in New International in August 1941. And that is the end of the chapter as a whole. Thank you for listening.